All right, everyone, welcome to Crash Course Apologetics, where I summarize the work of Christian scholars in animated videos and also interviews like this one that you'll watch tonight. My guest tonight is Dr. Matthew Flanagan. He is, I'll let you tell a little bit about yourself in a second, but the way that I found out about him was primarily through his association with Dr. Paul Copan, who I've also interviewed on my channel. And they wrote an excellent book together called Did God Really Command Genocide? And it's a super engaging, thorough book that looks at some of the difficult passages in the Bible that speak of the Canaanites, God's command to drive them out, and what some people call genocide. So there's a section in that book, I think it's near the end of the book, on divine command theory. And this is where, I don't know, did you primarily write those chapters?
Yeah. Primarily write. Shouldn't dish Paul, but I did primarily write that chapter.
Yeah. So I've had a feeling just from reading your other work that it was probably primarily you were the driving force behind that one. So it was a great section of the book. Like, the whole book's great, but I really enjoyed that section. And so that's why I wanted to interview you. I have my own questions about divine command theory, and you really helped me wrestle with those and come to some satisfactory conclusions. So I really appreciate your work.
We're about to go to our hottest month of the year. Yeah.
Well, tell us just briefly about how you got into moral philosophy, and in particular, and then we'll go ahead and jump into the section of the book that on divine command theory.
Sure. So I finished high school. I just recently become a Christian in my sort of late teens, and I went to university, and I sort of wasn't sure what I was going to do. And when I filled out my courses, I discovered I had to do the subject called philosophy. And everybody warned me not to do the subject and said it was, you'd run into all these people who knew how to argue really well, and they would, attack your faith, and they would argue you out of your faith, and they would, and it was a really, really crazy subject. But I had to do it for timetable reasons. And so I got involved and did about one lecture, just loved it, just thought this is fantastic, this is right up my alley. Really enjoyed thinking about these things carefully and critically, really enjoyed engaging in dialogue and discussion with people, debating with people who had different points of view. Really enjoyed it. And very early on, I liked ethical philosophy, largely because I think ethics is an area of philosophy where I think most of us, to some extent, practice it every day. Like philosophy of language or philosophy of mind. A lot of people won't really have thought about that, but most people will have thought about moral and political are often just moral applied to society. So that was sort of familiar to me. And I did a lecture early on. I did a lecture in moral philosophy, and the first thing the lecturer said was, some of you will be frustrated that you have certain religious beliefs or certain religious commitments, and you can't really take those into account when you're engaging in any kind of moral thinking about these questions, because there's this famous question by Plato called, the Youthfro Dilemma, and it shows that all religious-based ethics are false.
Wow.
And this was presented to me, I think, in probably my first, maybe my second lecture in moral philosophy. And all the students in the class who were sort of skeptics used to just sort of throw this in my face every time I brought up my religious views, and I thought, well, I'm going to figure this out. So I went and began sort of reading on that and thinking about that, and it's never really stopped. It just became a directed research project I did when I did my master's, and I did some work on it, a little bit of work on it when I was doing my Ph.D. thesis, presented a few papers at conferences on it, and got asked to, in the US, people came and asked me to present some papers on it, and it really kind of went from there. And then, of course, as you'll know, last year I was interviewed by Cameron on Capturing Christianity, and Jason Dow had a dialogue on it, which I thought was a really, really enjoyable dialogue. Really enjoyed that, and so it's sort of gone from there. So it's just something I've been quietly working away at and thinking about and what have you. Yeah,
that dialogue was when I first heard you expand kind of at length and see you interact with someone that's a proponent of the Euthyphro Dilemma. And I've told Cameron personally and publicly, I've made it known, that's my favorite dialogue that of everyone he's had on his channel, you were my favorite one. Partly, I think, because I'm just so interested in this topic, and so I'm really excited to get to interview you. All right, well, let's jump in. First, let's begin with where you start in the book. You ask, what is divine command theory? That's the title of the chapter. So tell us what divine command theory is.
Okay, so there are lots of different kinds of divine command theories. So in the book, I focus on what is probably the dominant kind being defended today, like the one that people like Robert Adams, William Lane Craig, Stephen Evans put forward. And that's really quite the thesis is really quite simple. The thesis is that the property of being morally required is the same property as the property of being commanded by God. So those are identical properties, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think of it this way, we sort of think that certain actions have moral features or moral properties. Don't think of property in any kind of complex way. Just think of it in terms of features or aspects or whatever. So if someone engages in the brutal murder of a child, we can say all kinds of things about the physics of that property, about the biochemical aspects or properties of that action. But most of us also think that that action is morally prohibited or morally wrong, mm-hmm. right? That action is such that we are required to not do it. So it has these kinds of moral features. And there's a debate in meta-ethics about, well, what are those moral features? Are they natural properties? Are they non-natural properties? Are they conventions? Mm-hmm. And so the divine command theory says, well, this property is the property of being morally required, is the property of being commanded by God. Basically, mm-hmm. that's the thesis.
And do you have an example or two that, or analogies that would be helpful for us to understand that kind of property-identity relationship?
Right, so the standard in the literature, and I didn't come up with this because I've said this before, and people will say, I've heard people say, Christian apologists always bring this up. So I just want to clear, it actually doesn't come from Christian apologists. It comes from people like Saul Kripke and Hilary Putnam and philosophers like that. And the standard example is water and H2O, right? So some people, there are some forms of identity what you call analytic identities. So if I said a bachelor is an unmarried man, in philosophy, we call that an analytic identity. In other words, that's an identity statement, but it's an identity statement that's true in virtue of the meaning of the words. The word bachelor means unmarried man. And you can work out that identity statement is true simply by understanding what the word bachelor means. Once you analyze the concept of a bachelor correctly, it's an unmarried man. Well, in the early 20th century, a lot of philosophers came to the conclusion there were also what they call synthetic identity relationships, right? And these are relationships which you don't tell by examining the meaning of the concepts or the meaning of the words. You tell by looking at the facts of the world and working it out. And the example they gave is water is H2O. Mm-hmm. I couldn't, by examining the concept of water, just by examining the water, the definition of the word water, I know there's these things called atoms, and there's these things called molecules, and there's one atom called hydrogen atoms, and there's one atom, I couldn't do that. That requires substantive chemistry to figure that out. But we know that the property of being water is identical with the property of being H2O, right there. If I talk about water, and H2O, I'm talking about the same thing. Those are different ways of referring to the same thing. They're not true by definition. We know they're true by our theorizing about the world, in this case, our sort of scientific theorizing about the world. But that's a true identity statement. Another example that's sometimes used is when people talk about the morning star and the evening star, right? Mm-hmm. So in the morning, the first star that comes out, and last star to go away in the morning, what they call the morning star, and the first star to come out in the evening, they're actually the planet Venus. They both refer, those phrases, the morning star and the evening star, refer to the same thing. They refer to the same star, right? Different. You might say it has the property of being the morning star. It has the property of being the evening star. Same star. Or if you were to look in, popular fiction, with DC Comics and what have you. So Superman is Clark Kent, right? So Superman is the description of one particular character. Clark Kent is the description of another character. And when we know enough about the DC comic, particularly when we see it on the movie screen and they make it really simple for us, we see that Superman and Clark Kent are the same person. So these two descriptions refer to the same thing, right? So that's an example of a property identity statement, right? It's where you have two things that you can describe in different ways, but you realize they refer to the same thing. You're talking about the same thing. You might be using you might be using slightly different language, slightly different concept, but you're referring to the same thing.
Perfect.
Is that clear?
Yeah,
Yeah.
those are all great examples. Okay, so the divine command theory says the property of, the property of right is the same property as being commanded by God. So
Correct.
if
Yeah.
something's right, then it is commanded by God. Okay,
Yeah.
well, what do divine command theorists mean when they use the term God then? So we need to be clear about this.
Right. So they're generally assuming a concept of God that has been built up in sort of Christian, Jewish, and Islamic theology for several thousand of years. So there was a concept of God in those traditions, particularly in the Christian tradition, which is where I come from, but it's common roughly to all three of them. And this is the idea of an immaterial person who is essentially omniscient, essentially omnipotent, or all-powerful, who is essentially loving and just, and that sort of thing, right? The standard conception of God. So it's not just a generic conception of some deity of some sort. It's a deity that is understood as having particular attributes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is the deity that has the concept of God that has those attributes. That's what we're referring to when we use the word God. And the divine command theorist is the claim that the property of being morally required is properly being commanded by the God that meets that description, right? The being that description or that conception refers to, right? And of course, obviously, Christians and Jews and Muslims, that's, if you like, the ballpark conception. They can debate a little bit about the precise details, and I think we might get into some of that today. So, some debate about what exactly is the nature of God in time. Is he timeless, or is he in time, or is he outside of time? There are slightly different ways of defining omnipotence and slightly different ways of defining omniscience, all this stuff. But the ballpark conception is common, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the conception. That's the conception that's at play when divine command theorists talk about God, right?
Yeah,
so if
perfect.
you engage with divine command theory, if you debate, important thing when you engage with anyone, like if I'm engaging when I was engaging with Jason Thibodeau, it's important that if he puts forward a position, I engage with the position as he put it forward, right? So if he defines his terms a particular way, or if he has a particular conception of, say, a reason, or he has a particular conception of something, and I want to criticize it, the proper method is to criticize the conception he gives. I don't have the liberty to make my own, replace what he said with what I've decided to make up, and then attack that, right? That would be a strong fallacy. So it's important when we engage in these things, whether we agree with the conceptions or the assumptions of the theory or not, that we engage the theory on its own terms. We're willing to say, okay, let's understand how the person who expounds this theory thinks. Let's understand what the assumptions he makes are. Let's look at the theory on those terms and have a discussion about it. And then you can discuss the plausibility and implausibility and so on, right?
Perfect. Very clear. All right. And this will come up too, but just to kind of recite what you say in the book, you talk about God as being fully informed, perfectly rational, loving, compassionate, kind. You list some of these characteristics.
Yeah. So the reason of that is that the word omniscient is somewhat abstract, and so the point I'm making there is that omniscient is the same thing. I mean, omniscient entails being fully informed, right? And omniscient entails, at least I think, being rational, right? And I think that's important because while in secular ethics a divine command theory is often not taken very seriously, it is quite common in secular ethics to take seriously theories which say, well, look, what's right is what a fully rational person would endorse.
Yeah.
You know what? I mean, what a person who was impartial and fully aware of all the facts and was kind of sympathetic to everybody, what would he want us to do? That's really, really common in the secular ethics. So the point I was making in my book was to say, look, when you actually understand what the theist is talking about, it's a little bit easily for you to raise some of these kinds of concerns, right? Some of these concerns that I think secular ethicists raise, I do at times find it a little bit blind in the sense that I'm willing to say, look, you actually grant this. If we weren't talking about omniscient, if we were using slightly different terms which amount to the same thing, you wouldn't even raise this objection, right? Your own positions or your discussion of this own stuff within secular meta-ethics has already hashed some of this out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's using those terms. Basically point out to people, sometimes people hear the word omniscient and they go, oh, that's this religious concept, and I think their guard goes up. So I'm trying to say, well, look, omniscient, that means knows all the facts, right? So that means fully informed.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't say something about a fully informed being and then not say it about an omniscient being. That seems to me to be inconsistent. You can't talk about what a perfectly rational person would do and then turn around and say, oh, by the way, God wouldn't do this.
Mm-hmm.
Not if you've got the conception of God. Not if you've got the conception of God that's the conception of God that's at play in, say, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions, where you're talking about, if you like, a cognitively ideal being, right? A being whose knowledge, whose rational capacities, whose awareness of the world is vastly superior to any other being in existence, right?
Mm-hmm.
That seems to me that would be a God that was rational par excellence, right? In some sense of that word. So the point I was making when I was doing that was sort of bringing people back to seeing what the implications of what they were saying actually meant, maybe in concepts they're more familiar with.
That's good. That's really helpful. And that, I can't believe how big of a role this plays in answering objections that people raise against divine command theory. Is what is the concept of God that you are objecting to? And let's make sure that we agree on those terms. It's so critical. So that will come up, I'm sure, as we go along. All right, well, in the book, you note two different aspects of divine command theory. One is this distinction between the good and the right. Let's, and I'll say the other one real quick, and then we can unpack each one. The other one is making clear that divine command theory is not claiming that the word wrong means, the definition of the word wrong does not mean prohibited by God. And it's not claiming that you cannot know or recognize moral obligations unless you believe in God.
Right.
So those are the kind of distinctions you make. So unpack that first one, that the good is not the same as the right.
Okay, so the word good is actually hugely ambiguous, right? So I could say, I had a really good sauna last night. It was really, really good, right? I could say Carlos the Jackal is a really good hitman, right? I could say, I mean, you guys won't get this reference. I could say Richie McCaw is a really good rugby player, right? I can use the word good in all kinds of senses, many of them which are not moral at all, right? When I say Carlos the Jackal is a good hitman, I'm not saying he's a morally excellent hitman, right? I'm saying something like he's a proficient hitman, or he's very good at the skill of being a hitman. When I say Richie McCaw is a good rugby player, I'm saying he's very good at that. When I say something like the sauna was really good, I mean it was enjoyable, right? So we use the word good very, very broadly. There's a concept of the good where something is good for us, where I say something like, it's good for us that, it's good for me that I eat a low-carb diet, right? There's nothing moral in that at all. So good is very, very broad. And there's a lot of discussion in ethical theory about just how we understand goodness in general. Is there a kind of common concept of goodness that applies across all these different domains that we can use in all those different situations, or are there just multiple different concepts of good, right? So the goods, to start with, you understand the word good is very ambiguous. And so when you're doing moral theory, you have to be a little bit careful about using it. In the book, I draw the distinction between what's often called moral goodness and the obligatory. Mm-hmm. And the distinction I use, which I sort of pinched off Stephen Evans, is this. I would say it was good for me to give my kidney to a needy stranger. Let's suppose there was a stranger who needed a kidney, and I agreed to have one of my kidneys taken out of my body and given to them, right? Mm-hmm. I think, intuitively, I think many of us, or most of us, would say, yeah, that's a good action. Mm-hmm. But it's not obviously that I'm obligated to do that, right? It's not obvious that I'm morally required to do that, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea of being morally required is much more specific than the concept of good, right? Goodness is very broad. Mm-hmm. We can use it in lots of non-moral senses. And then even in a moral sense, we can use it of what people often call an action which is supererogatory, an action that's really, really good but not required, right? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the obligatory is what we're kind of like required to do. So we recognize there are certain actions like, let's say an action like rape. We're required to not rape. It's not just a nice thing to not do, right? It's not just like, well, you're really nice if I didn't rape people. No, we're morally required to not rape people, right? That's something that is morally prohibited, right? We have to do that. If we don't do that, if we violate that and we rape people, or we murder people, or we do something like that, then we are subject to legitimate moral blame. Mm-hmm. We are guilty. It might be appropriate to censure us, and if it's a really severe offence, it might even require us to be punished in some way, right? This is something that, from the moral perspective, is demanded of us. It's compulsory from the moral perspective, that kind of thing, right? So the obligatory is a much stronger concept than the good. And it's also, I think, much more central to a lot of our moral discourse, because if we just were talking about things being nice or good or it would be really nice if I did this, or really, it wouldn't have the kind of force that discourse has, right? It wouldn't have the kind of action guiding urgency that, let's say, there is when we see starving children in, I don't know, in somewhere like Syria, thousands of refugees coming to the border, and we think they're all going to die, and we think, man, someone's got to do something about that. We don't, it's just a nice thing if they all die. Who cares? We don't think that way. We think there's this kind of urgency. Morality requires something of us here, and if we don't meet this, there's something very, very wrong with us. We are guilty, we are blameworthy, we are subject to censure, some kind of punishment of some sort, and so on. Right? Those are the kinds of ideas that I think are implicit in the obligatory. Right? And this is, and most moral debates about, when we debate about, say, is capital punishment or right or wrong, we debate about is abortion right or wrong. We're not talking about whether it's a nice thing or not, right? We're talking about whether there is some kind of obligation to refrain from these things, or are these things morally permissible? Are they something that there is no moral obligation to refrain from? And that's really at the heart of a lot of debate. Yeah.
Very good.
So,
that helps, that distinction. And the second one, like I said, was that the word wrong, the definition of the word wrong, is not prohibited by God.
Right.
Do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, so that goes back to the point I was talking about earlier about analytic and synthetic identity statements. I know this is a little bit technical and a little bit unfamiliar to people. So the reason I put that in there is it's often common for people to sort of say, a divine command theory says that the word wrong means prohibited by God, and then you can give arguments that show that that's a really implausible analysis of how we use language. So, for example, an atheist says, oh, look, I think this action is wrong, but I don't think God prohibited it, right? An atheist says that, and that doesn't seem to be a self-contradictory statement when an atheist says that. I mean, I think it's mistaken. I think there is a God, but I don't think it's self-contradictory. But if the word wrongness meant prohibited by God, that would seem to be a self-contradictory statement, right? So it doesn't seem to be plausible to say that the use of moral language is such that when a person says such and such is wrong, they are saying God prohibited this, right? So if you see it as a view about the meaning of moral language, there's a kind of prima facie implausibility to it, right? The problem is, however, is that when someone says moral requirements are identical to divine commands, they're not making a claim about moral language at all, right? They're making a claim about the world. They're saying this thing in the world is identical with this thing in the world, right? Or the property that is picked out by this statement is identical with the property that's picked out about this statement. They're not making a claim about the use of language. They're making a substantive claim about reality, right? It's a different kind of claim. And the example I give in the book is, again, I go back to the standard example of water is H2O, right? When a person says water is H2O, they're not giving a definition of the meaning of the word water. So an ancient Greek thinker like Aristotle could talk about water, and he knew what he was talking about, right? He didn't have a deficient language. It wasn't that he kind of was confused and he meant to refer to atoms, but he just didn't understand that that's what he was referring to. No, he had he was referring to particular bodies of liquid that he saw, and the term legitimately meant that, and so on, right? So the claim water is H2O is not a meaning of language, right? It's a substantive scientific metaphysical claim about the world. So it's important to be clear about that, because there's a whole lot of arguments that turn on the fact that people mistakenly construe a divine command theory as a theory about moral language and then attack the thesis about moral language. And even if you attack the thesis about moral language, it doesn't prove the thesis is true about the world, right? Even if I can show that Aristotle doesn't mean to refer to atoms when he uses the word water, doesn't mean water isn't H2O, right? If Lois Lane is sitting across the desk from the mild-mannered reporter Clark Kent, right, and she's referring to Clark and she's talking about his latest coverage of this new criminal called the Joker, no, not the Joker, it's Gotham, but this new criminal that's in the area, and she has no idea about his alter ego, right? She has no idea that he's Superman, right? She's referring to Clark Kent. She's using the language Clark Kent in a perfectly consistent way. She's a competent user of that term. She's not meaning to say anything about Superman, yet the person she refers to is Superman, right? The substantive identity claim is a very different kind of claim to the claim about language, right? And so you don't refute a divine command theory by pointing out that the words don't mean this, right? Because I grant that and say, yeah, I agree. I don't think atheists mean to refer to God when they use moral discord. Of course, fine. I agree with that. The question is whether what they refer to with that discourse, what that is, and is that identical with God's commands, right?
Very
and
good.
whether they intend to say that or not is a different question, right? It's a difference between making a thesis about what language means and a thesis about what language refers to. Not the same thing, right?
Yep, right. Okay, so one more distinction, and that was that, and this is related, you kind of hit on it with your examples there, but you're not claiming that one cannot know or recognize moral obligations unless one believes in God. So
Right.
give the
So
water example or Clark Kent example.
Water example is the same thing, like a person who knew nothing about contemporary chemistry, right? They could probably recognize water, right? And in fact, for centuries, there were whole cultures who swam, who sailed, who drank water, who knew you could boil water, who had all kinds of accurate information about water. You know, I live in New Zealand, and the Polynesians discovered New Zealand and circumnavigated a quarter of the globe before the English could, with the stars and with what we would call very primitive technology, right? So there was a nation of people very proficient in the use of water, knew what water was, understood water really, really well, understood the properties of the surface properties of water really, really well, had no knowledge whatsoever scientifically of the nature of water, right? They didn't know that water was identical to H2O. They didn't know about atomic theory. They didn't know about chemistry. They didn't know about hydrogen. They didn't know about oxygen, but they knew about water, right? So what does that example show us? It shows that whether two things are identical has no entailment as to whether or not someone who believes in one of those things can believe in the other, right? It's quite possible, it's quite coherent to say A is identical to B, and also accept that someone who doesn't believe in A or doesn't know anything about A can believe in B. And again, this is important because there's a huge number of literature, particularly at the popular atheist level here, where people respond to a divine command theory by saying something like this: well, I know atheists who are moral people, all right? And the assumption is that if an atheist is a moral person, that shows that moral properties are not identical to God's commands. In other words, because this person doesn't believe in God, because this person doesn't believe in God, it follows that moral requirements can't be identical to God's commands, and that simply doesn't follow. Pacific Island people did not know about water or H2O. Doesn't follow they weren't competent users of water, right? Similar thing is people will sometimes say something like, well, look, atheists can recognize right and wrong. Yeah, they can. They can do it very well. Many secular moral philosophers who are atheists can recognize right and wrong very, very well. But that doesn't mean that moral requirements are identical to are not identical to divine commands.
Right.
Because the claim that two things are identical to one another has no entailment about, well, if I know one, I must know the other. In fact, a lot of the most important identity claims we have aren't like that. There are many things which we have discovered over the years where something that we all knew about and we referred to for many, many years, we were quite mistaken about its identity. We didn't understand its nature at all. A lot of scientific discoveries are based on this very idea that people can recognize one thing and be completely ignorant about what it actually refers to, or they can have a theory that leads them to mistakenly identify what that thing is. So, the ancient Greeks had a very comprehensive natural philosophy, where they had all kinds of theories about the nature of water and the nature of stars and the nature of everything, which we would now say are mistaken. But they knew about the stars, and they could chart it and its planets and the orbit of the major planets, and they knew lots of stuff about these things, right? They could competently measure times and places and all sorts of stuff, right? So I guess the uptake here is that a divine command theory has no entailment whatsoever along the lines that atheists don't know what right and wrong is, or atheists can't be moral people. And I kind of say that with a bit of trepidation, because my experience in presenting this is that I will often say this at the start of a talk, and then a Q&A will come along, and in the Q&A someone will put their hand up and they will say, but atheists know what's right and wrong, or moral people. Or they'll say something like, but I know people who are moral who have never read the Bible, and I must admit it does get frustrating after a while, because in the literature this has been said over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
The major critics like Wielenberg, Wes Morrison point this out. The major supporters point this out, and you go to the Freethinker website, and then the first thing that comes up every time, and you want to face palm your head saying, the claim that two things are identical has no implication about whether one person who believes in one of those descriptions actually believes in the other or knows about the other.
Yeah. Very good. And I hope that doesn't come up again. But
I hope it's clear, because I know that sometimes when I talk about property identity, it's a kind of arcane metaphysical discussion, and people kind of go, oh gosh, it's this silly philosophical distinction, and roll their eyes and kind of ignore it. And it is a bit tedious to go through. But once you get it, and you get that distinction, suddenly there's clarity on a whole lot of issues in this debate.
Well, I think the water example, the Clark Kent example, the Morning Star, Evening Star example, the Matthew Levi example, all those are great for quickly getting the concept of a property identity. Okay, well, let's take about the next 45 minutes to go through about 10 objections. I actually wrote down 11. And if we have time to hit all of them, you've actually, it's amazing to me, simply by defining our terms and making a couple of distinctions, we've already addressed some of these objections. So you can run through these pretty quickly, but these are the ones that you bring up in the book. Okay. So the first one is an objection based on mistaken meaning, semantics. And I can't remember it started with a G, the guy's name that raises this. But so explain this one.
So Gensler, just trying to remember exactly what Gensler says, but Gensler says something along the lines of this. He points out that an atheist could say, I believe abortion is immoral, but I think there is no God, right? And when he says that, he doesn't seem to be engaging in a self-contradiction, right? He doesn't seem to be saying, his statement doesn't seem to be like this. I believe in bachelors, but I believe that no man is unmarried. Right? If I said, I believe in bachelors, but I believe no man is unmarried, you would take me to have contradicted myself, right? You would take my statement to be nonsense. And you would suggest that I really did not understand what I was saying, right? But when an atheist says, I believe abortion is immoral, or I believe abortion is wrong, but there is no God, we don't take him as uttering anything as silly as what I just gave with the bachelor example, right? We don't take him to be contradicting himself. We take his statement to be completely coherent. We may agree with it, we may disagree with it, but we would think that it was a coherent statement, and we would think that he probably understood the meaning of what he was saying, that he wasn't confused about the terms he was using, right? And so Gensler uses this example, and the point Gensler then makes from that is to say, so this shows that the term, such and such is right, does not have the same meaning, or is not synonymous in meaning with the term, this is prohibited, this is commanded by God, right? That's basically Gensler's argument, right?
Yeah.
And Gensler takes that, it's very quick in an introduction to ethics book. It's one of those introductions to ethics books where they have a quick discussion of divine command theory, and I must admit, those kinds of books irritate me because I think they're always wrong. But it's an example he uses, and it's an example that used to be fairly common in the sort of stuff when you'd go into university and maybe do a first year course, and then the textbook would be open, and this is the kind of objection that would be raised, right? And so the claim is, well, look, obviously the word such and such is right is not synonymous with the word such and such is commanded by God, and then that's taken to refute a divine command theory. Right.
So we have pretty much already answered this, because you've said you don't have to believe in both properties. You can believe in one property and not believe in the other, and you can still know right and wrong.
So the point is that what that argument shows, if it's a successful argument, is it shows that the word or the phrase abortion is wrong does not have a synonymous meaning with the phrase God has prohibited abortion, right? So it shows us that those two phrases, those two words, those two semantic tokens, if you like, do not have a synonymous meaning. The problem is the fact that two terms don't have a synonymous meaning doesn't entail anything about whether or not what those terms refer to is identical or not. Right. So just as I would argue that the term water does not have a synonymous meaning with the term H2O, right? So Aristotle could talk about, so use the atheist example, you could use the same example about Aristotle. So Aristotle looks out across the Aegean Sea. He's sitting in Macedonia, and he looks out across the Aegean Sea, and he's waiting for news about Alexander's campaigns in Asia. And he sits there and he goes, I believe the Aegean Sea exists, but I don't believe in atoms. Right? Because he was a critic of atomism, right? Now, that statement doesn't seem self-contradictory. It seems to me that Aristotle knows exactly what he's referring to. He's looking at the Aegean Sea, and he knows what he's talking about, right? But does that mean that water is not H2O? Would anyone think, well, look, I can show you an example. Here's a guy who doesn't believe in atoms, and he can refer to water competently. There you go. Water is not identical to H2O. No one would say that, right? Because we don't think that semantics, we don't think that kind of semantic synonymous, that synonymity of meaning, if you like, between terms entails that what those terms refer to as aren't identical, right? So it's just that mistake, right? It's a mistake of confusing a claim about what language means with a claim about the identity of the things we refer to with language.
Perfect. Okay, so that was the semantic objection. So one down. Now here's the second one. This is the epistemic objection. Okay, right. So this is an objection based on moral knowledge. And in the book, you mentioned that Morriston brings this up. And I sent you a link the other day where Alexander Proust from the University of Baylor University raised this kind of objection. So explain what we mean when we say an objection to divine command theory based on moral knowledge.
So there are different versions of this. Some are better than others. So there's a kind of popular version, which I address in the book, and then there's a more substantive one, which is raised by Eric Wielenberg, Wes Morriston. You mentioned Alexander Proust has raised it recently. So let's deal with the sort of more popular one first. So the more popular one is to give various examples of cases where people appear to have moral knowledge. They appear to know things about right and wrong, independently of any knowledge they have of God or God's commands, right? So you might run into an atheist who hears about the terrible, brutal kidnapping and torture of some child, and he says, wow, that's wrong, right? And that seems to express moral knowledge on the part of the atheist. Now, seeing this atheist doesn't believe in God, that knowledge is entirely independent of any knowledge he has about God or God's commands, right? Similarly, many people learn about right and wrong before they convert to Christianity or before they learn theological ethics. So they have this knowledge of right and wrong prior to any knowledge they have of divine commands or purported divine commands. And in fact, often, when we're assessing purported divine commands, let's suppose someone, claims that God commanded something and someone else says, no, he didn't. Sometimes we draw on our moral knowledge to assess those claims, right? So we're in doing that, we're suggesting that our knowledge of what's right and wrong is in some sense independent of our knowledge of what God did and did not command, right? So a series of examples which are designed to show that our knowledge of right and wrong is prior to, or can be prior to, and can be completely independent of our knowledge of God's commands, right? Right. Again, the problem is a divine command theorist says that moral requirements are identical with divine commands, but the claim that one thing is identical to another doesn't entail that you know one, that your knowledge of one is dependent upon the other, right? So two things are identical. It's quite possible for you to have knowledge about one of the things that you're referring to, and not about the other. Right? This happens all the time. And the Aristotle example I gave before is an example. Aristotle had lots of knowledge about the Aegean Sea, knew nothing about hydrogen and oxygen, right? In the DC comic books, Lois Lane could know lots of stuff about Clark Kent, and she might early in her career be a skeptic about these Superman reports, right? So she's this reporter, she hears about this guy in this cape who's flying around and thinks, oh, this is ridiculous. I'm a cynical journalist, I'm going to disprove this. So she looks across at Clark Kent, who's at the desk across from her, and says, Clark, I'm going to disprove this Superman guy. This is a load of rubbish, right? So she has lots of knowledge of Clark Kent, right? Knows all about Clark Kent. He's right in front of her. And she's a skeptic about Superman. Yet Clark Kent is identical to Superman, right? So it's quite possible for two things to be identical to each other. without it being the case that if you know about one, you must know about the other, or your knowledge of one is dependent on your knowledge of the other.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just a general point in that when we talk about dependence relationships, you can distinguish between how you can say that one belief you have depends on another belief you have is quite different to saying the existence of one thing depends upon the existence of another.
Mm-hmm.
So an example that the philosopher Philip Quinn uses is our knowledge, let's say, take of the Big Bang, right? Our knowledge of the Big Bang is dependent of our knowledge of the current state of the universe, right? So we look at the current state of the universe, and there's certain phenomena we try and explain, and we extrapolate back in time. And when we rely on this knowledge and our process of extrapolation from this knowledge, we get to the idea that there was a Big Bang. So our knowledge of the Big Bang, our current state of the universe comes first in our knowledge, and then the Big Bang is postulated to explain it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But which came first in reality, right? In reality, the Big Bang came first, and the current state of the universe depends upon it, right?
Mm-hmm.
The current universe as it currently is depends for its existence and its nature on the Big Bang, right? So the order that we know things in and the order in which things occur in existence is not necessarily the same. Often we know our knowledge goes present to past when in fact in reality it goes past to present, right?
Right.
If a detective is investigating a crime, he goes to the murder scene first and he looks at the body and he looks at the evidence of the murder scene, and then from there he tries to reason back to work out who committed the murder.
Mm-hmm.
But all that evidence depends for its existence on the murder, right? The reason there's a dead body there is because of the murderer, right? So it's just a mistake to suggest that because one thing depends upon another for its existence or for its nature, it follows that your knowledge of it must depend on it in the same way. Often we can know the effects first and the causes later, right? And the same is true with identity statements. We often can identify something under one description and be completely ignorant of it under another description, or even misidentify it under another description, right?
Mm-hmm.
So nothing about a divine command theory entails that you can't have knowledge of morality independent of your knowledge of purported divine commands, or that you can't know about right and wrong first and then discover about God's commands later, or anything like that. So that's the popular level of, right? Right. So now you want to talk about the more sophisticated one, right?
Right.
So the more sophisticated one is Wes Morrison puts it forward. Eric Wielenberg's taken it up, and this is a little bit more sophisticated. It sort of suggests that you can't really be bound by an obligation unless you kind of know. So the idea is you can't really, even if a divine command could exist, you can't really be bound by a divine command, or you can't be obligated by a divine command unless you know that it's from God. This is an argument that people like Wes Morrison and Eric Wielenberg have put forward. And so I often call it the reasonable believer's objection. And it kind of goes like this. Firstly, it starts off by saying there are a group of people who you call reasonable unbelievers. So these are people, let's say someone is brought up in an atheist home. From the time they're very, very small, they're taught there's no God. Mm-hmm. And they're brought up in this community, and they never ever hear any case made ever for God's existence. All the experts they run into say there's no God. They've been brought up to believe this. And so Morrison wants to say this person's a reasonable non-believer, right? They don't believe in God, and this doesn't seem to be due to some kind of negligence on their part. You know, given all the evidence they have, given all the facts that they're aware of, given all the facts they could be aware of, given their situation, their non-belief is reasonable. So this is how he sort of starts off, right? But then he suggests that if you're a reasonable non-believer, if God issues a command to you and you don't recognize the command comes from God, then you can't really be obligated by that command. Mm-hmm. And he gives an example to show this. So the example he gives is an example of someone who receives a note about their car, right? And the note says, please pick my car up and drive it to me, right? The keys are in the car. I've left the keys in the car. Please pick it up and drive it to me. And he says, unless you know who wrote this letter, you're under no obligation. Like if your wife wrote that letter, right, and you knew it was from your wife, you think, yeah, I should go get that car. But what if that letter was written by a terrorist, right, and he wanted to put the car somewhere for a car bomb, right? You know, wouldn't be obligated to pick it up, right? So what Morrison wants to suggest is that if you just receive if you just hear a command, right, and you don't know who the source of the command is, you're not obligated to it, right? Unless you know who the source of the command is, who issued the command, you can't be obligated to obey it, right? That's kind of the idea. And Proust gives a similar example. Eric Wielenberg gives a similar example. So the idea is that you can only be obligated by a command if you are aware of the person who commanded it, right?
Reasonable non-believer in this case.
Right. And so then a reasonable non-believer won't recognize, he'll be aware of an obligation to not kill, let's say, but he won't be aware that this is a command from God, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore he can't be obligated by the command. That's the kind of argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So is that clear? I hope that.
Yeah. Now, when you said it like that at the end, it seems like there's kind of a leap there. But you can go ahead and answer it. But it just seems like Son of O, for example. It's the guy that commented here in the video. He said, if you're walking along the beach and you come across a no trespassing sign, you don't know who put that. You don't know who put that sign there. You have no clue. Do you, do you not have to obey it? Can you just be like, well, they failed to make me aware of who their authority is, so I don't have to follow that one.
Right. So it's interesting that somebody, what did you say, Son of Ode, posted that up, did he?
So, like the letter O.
Right. Because that's actually the example I give, and that very example is the exact example I give in a paper I wrote in response to Eric Wielenberg. And he responded to it in his recent paper, and Bill Craig referenced it in his debate. So I think Son of O is engaged in a plagiarism there. Right. Yeah, and that's the example I use. So there are several examples like this, and that is, I think it's not true that a command. Sorry, how can I put this? I think it's not true that you are not obligated to obey a command unless you know the identity of the commander, right? Mm-hmm. All that you need is to be aware that this command all you need to be aware of is that this command is authoritative. Mm-hmm. Right. So if I put it this way, if I perceive the imperative or the prescription that the commander is issuing, and I perceive that it is authoritative over me, then that's enough to obligate me, even if I don't know the identity of the commander. Right. And the example I gave is exactly that. I'm walking along the beach, and there's what I think is a public right of way. So I don't know if you have them in America, but we have public right of ways where you might have private property on the beach, mm-hmm. but to ensure that people have access to the beach, by law, they're allowed to walk across your property to go to the beach. It's kind of public right of way, right? So right of way across the property, right? So I'm walking along the beach, and I see what I think is a right of way. So I'm about to cross this right of way, and then I come across a sign that says, "No trespassers." No trespassing, private property, no trespassing, trespassers will be prosecuted, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I have no idea who owns the property, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know who the owner of that property is, right? I may have no opinion at all on who the owner of the property is, or I may have a completely mistaken view on who the owner of the property is, right? But that doesn't seem to matter, right? As soon as I see that sign, I'm under an obligation to not enter the property. Why? Well, because I recognize the imperative, do not enter, mm-hmm. and I recognize that whoever the owner is, in other words, whoever the person who has the authority to issue this has issued it. So I know the imperative, and I know the imperative is authoritative over my conduct. And I also, in that situation, know that I'm blameworthy if I
trespass,
act contrary to it.
Yeah.
Right? So I know those three things. Then it seems it doesn't matter whether or not I can identify who issued the command, right? So that's one example I use in more recent writings. And an earlier example, I used an example that we used to have here in New Zealand. So in New Zealand, we used to have the police force used to be divided into two branches. And there was what you called the police, who dealt with crime and burglary and theft. And there was what we called the Ministry of Transport, who dealt with traffic offences, right? Mm-hmm. And they were separate branches of the government. They were literally separate government departments up until sort of, I think, the early 90s. They were separate government departments. Well, when I was younger, we had some Canadians come and stay with us, and whenever they saw the Ministry of Transport, they just thought it was the police, right? They just, and their concept was just the police, right? And so I kind of put this example. Let's suppose these Canadians are driving home one day and they're going a little bit fast, and they're on the roads in New Zealand, and the Ministry of Transport drives behind them and yells, "Pull over," right? And they look out the window and they think, oh, the police are ordering me to pull over, right? Because they think this is the police. They don't understand the subtleties of New Zealand's system, right? We still think they have an obligation to pull over, right? We don't think that the fact that they thought this was the police, but it's not really, in any way means that they're not obligated to pull over, right? Why? Well, because they recognize the imperative, pull over, and they recognized that a legitimate authority has issued this command.
Yeah.
Or issued this to them. And as long as they know the imperative applies to them, and as long as they know that it's authoritative, then that seems to be enough, even if they don't know who issued it, even if they're completely mistaken about who issued it. So now let's return to our reasonable unbeliever. If our reasonable unbeliever recognizes there's an imperative, do not kill, and he recognizes the authority of morality, that seems to be enough to me, right? That seems to me to be enough to say that he is bound by that command, even if God issues a command and he just recognizes that, he doesn't recognize that God issued this command, he just recognizes this kind of requirement or imperative, it applies to me, it's authoritative, I would be blameworthy if I didn't do this, then he knows enough for that command, in my view, for that command to obligate him or to bind him and have the kind of binding force that morality has, right? So I don't think you need to have that kind of extra knowledge of who commanded and what have you for a command to generate an obligation, right? So that's how I would respond to a more sophisticated version.
Very good.
This has gone back and forth in the literature a little bit, and people give slightly different examples, like the one Proust does, and then I have to develop slightly different examples to respond to. But I think the argument stands.
Yeah. Okay, very good. So that was the second objection. The I think you call it the promulgation objection. Or there's a kind of epistemic objection there. So 2 down.
Eric Wielenberg would deny it's an epistemic objection. He says that it's an objection. He thinks the epistemic objection is about not knowing your obligations. He thinks that objection shows that atheists literally have no obligations. But I classify it under the epistemic objection because it kind of grows out of it. It's kind of like there's this move, it doesn't work, so then they try this move, and then that doesn't work, and so then they try this move. So there's this kind of dialectic where these arguments kind of get more refined and go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
Yeah. Okay, so 2 down. Now on to objection number 3. Okay, so this one is where you start getting into various forms of the Euthyphro Dilemma. Right. So before we bring the objections up, I think it would be helpful to just very, very quickly explain what the Euthyphro Dilemma is. Okay.
So the Euthyphro Dilemma is an argument that gets its name from a dialogue Plato wrote way back around sort of 400 BC, roughly. 400, 300, that sort of period of time. I don't know the exact date of the dialogue, but it's around that period of time. I think Socrates, his teacher, was executed in 399 BC. Right. So there's in this dialogue, Plato has a dialogue with a ancient Athenian, what you might call a priest or soothsayer, and it's about the nature of piety. And in this dialogue, Plato asks this question where he says, is something pious because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it's pious? And then there's a whole discussion about that, which goes up in all these tangents. Much of what people call the Euthyphro Dilemma today actually has nothing to do with that discussion. It's just that people took that question, if you like, and start with the same question. So they apply that question to divine command theory. So they say, is something wrong because God commands it, or does God command it because it's wrong? So you lay out, if you like, both these horns of the dilemma. Either something is wrong because God commands it, or God commands it because it's wrong, right? And then if you take the second horn, you've given up divine command ethics, right? If you say God commands something because it's wrong, then it must be wrong before or prior to or antecedent to God commanding it. In which case, it's there, it exists, antecedent to any command, right? And so obviously it can't be identical with God's commands because something can't be antecedent to itself, right? Something exists prior to itself, right? So that means that the divine command theorist takes the other horn, right? He thinks that, something is wrong because God prohibited it, right? Or something is required because God commanded it, right? And then the idea is that this horn, well, this is kind of ridiculous because it's subject to two problems. The first problem is, well, if you accept this, then that makes morality arbitrary, you know. It kind of makes morality depend on the arbitrary whims of God. It makes morality arbitrary in some kind of objectionable sense. The second line of argument that's usually raised is to say it also means that you can't, in any kind of meaningful sense, say that God is good, because you're making goodness depend upon God's commands, and then you're saying God is good, and so you end up with this kind of inability to make sense of those commitments. Mm-hmm. That's basically, in a nutshell, the Euthyphro argument as it's articulated today. It's generally more sophisticated than that. It's generally versions of that or attempts to refine that, but it's an attempt to take Plato's question and push it in a new way. And as I say, it actually has very little to do with what Plato originally said. Plato's original dialogue is actually quite interesting because much of the argument Plato pushes is against polytheism. Mm-hmm. You know, Euthyphro says that piety is what the gods love, and Plato points out, well, look, the gods love all these different things, right? Mm-hmm. There's lots of different
things. They contradict each other on what they love.
Right. And also, the interesting thing about the Euthyphro Dilemma is many people don't know the historical context. And I can't resist pointing this out because, from my perspective, Euthyphro is actually the good guy in this dialogue, and he gets a bad rep, mm-hmm. right? Because the situation that sets it up is that Euthyphro's father has slaves, and one of his servants has gotten drunk and killed one of his slaves. Mm-hmm. And so Euthyphro's father ties the slave up and throws him outside to prosecute him for murder, and then doesn't feed him, and the servant starves to death. Mm-hmm. And Euthyphro thinks, this is horrifically wicked. You should be prosecuted for this. And Plato's challenging him because, what? You're putting the honor of your father over against this lower class person? Mm-hmm. How dare you? You should be loyal to your father. Who cares if he killed some bum servant, right? He's your father. And Euthyphro is actually saying, no, piety is more than that. Piety means that I oppose murder even if my family members do it. Mm-hmm. Piety means I oppose murder even if it's done to lower class individuals. I think Euthyphro had more moral insight than Socrates in this dialogue. And
that's interesting, yeah.
And so it's often put forward as this is Plato defeating this kind of terrible religious fundamentalism. I don't think that's the case. And in fact, Plato in some of his writings is quite elitist. He has some quite egalitarian views. And I think it is somewhat of an irony that I mean, although it doesn't affect the original argument, but it's something of an irony that this dialogue is often pushed this way, and people have no awareness that, in my view, Euthyphro actually had the moral insight in this exchange.
That's really good. Okay, so the dilemma's really targeted for the voluntarist, the person that says, whatever God commands, God's completely sovereign, so whatever he commands, that's wrong. And many times, because that dilemma is targeted for voluntarism in like the very, strict sense of voluntarism, a lot of times it gets used on divine command theory, but the divine command theorist doesn't have to be a voluntarist, and I think people miss that point a lot.
Yeah, so often behind this objection is a kind of stereotype, right? Where the stereotype is that a divine command theorist thinks that morality is just this kind of arbitrary thing that God decrees, and he has no reason whatsoever. And often they tend to think too of a divine command theory as a theory of everything, right? So it's not just a theory of the nature of moral obligations, but it's a theory of every single possible concept of goodness, of value, of evaluation that you could think about. So often there's that kind of stereotype in the background. And what's interesting is I have yet to find in the history of philosophy anybody who holds a divine command theory like that. I've studied some of the history of divine command meta-ethics, and almost every version I've come across, I think there's maybe one exception I know of, almost every version that I come across limits it to as a theory of moral obligations. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like people invented the divine command theory they're attacking in the process of making this argument, which makes me very suspicious.
Yeah.
So I think there's, I think there's something deeply bad about this argument, even at that level, in the sense that it doesn't seem to me that people have really done their due diligence that you're supposed to do in philosophy, and that is, before you critique a position, you actually go out and find the best representative example of it, and you make sure you understand it really well, and you make sure you're clear on what these people actually say, and then you refute that, rather than just sort of making something up, refuting that, and then saying, oh, by the way, I've refuted divine command.
And then putting it in standard textbooks that undergrads read and say and dismiss it.
It's appallingly bad. It really is. And to some extent, part of this is the problem of specialization in academia, right? So most of us, when we study a subject like philosophy or history or whatever, but I know in philosophy, you start off broad, right? You start off doing an introduction to philosophy course where you learn every single topic and you might spend a week on each one. Mm-hmm. And in the ins and outs of the basics. And then you start to do papers on particular areas, and then you get on particular areas and so on. And so those who actually spend time really working on divine command meta-ethics are people who have read all the divine command ethicists and have looked at all the literature on it, and that's almost our area of specialty. Most people don't specialize in that area, right? Most people study it at one point, think, I don't really believe in that, and then they kind of go on and look at something else and specialize in something else and never revisit it. Mm-hmm. So it's always at the background of mind, this is divine command ethics, and it's never really dealt with. So Eric Wielenberg, in his book Robust Ethics, which is probably one of the best critiques of divine command ethics we've ever written, actually starts his book by pointing out that all the best secular ethicists pretty much ignore theistic ethics, and he thinks this is bad. Because he says, trying to develop these theories that they say answer these problems, and here's a potential alternative theory that might answer it better, and they ignore it. And they attack a straw man, and this really isn't good enough, and I want to write this book. The reason he writes this book is to try and address that problem. I mean, I agree with his diagnosis, I agree with the solution, but I agree with his diagnosis to some extent.
Okay, well, let's try to run through these objections that are based on the Euthyphro Dilemma. So the first, this is objection number 3 that we've gone through. This one's raised by Russ Schaefer-Landau. I believe he works. Right. I think he's a philosophy professor at the University of Wisconsin, if I remember. But
yeah, by the way, very, very, very good meta-ethicist. One of my favorite, actually. Yeah, very, very good. But yeah,
he raises the no reasons objection, and so explain this one to us, and then how do you answer it?
Okay, so this is a little bit technical, so I'll try and explain this. So the objection is fairly straightforward. The response is a little bit technical. So the objection is to say it goes a bit like this. Either God has reasons for issuing his commands, or he doesn't have reasons, right? So let's say he doesn't have reasons. Then by definition his commands are arbitrary, right? Because he has no reason for them. If you do something for no reason at all, it's arbitrary, right? On the other hand, let's say God does have reasons, right? And so we take that horn. Well, then if God has reasons for issuing his commands, then it's those reasons that make the action right, not God's commands. And so therefore a divine command theory is false, right? That's the argument, right?
Yeah, very simple to understand. So how do you answer it?
Right, so I think he's right about the first horn. I think if you say God has no reasons, you're committed to saying God's commands are arbitrary. There are moves people make to suggest that that's not a problem, but let's just stick that to the side, right? I think where it goes wrong is in the second part. The second part, he says, if God has reasons for issuing his commands, then those reasons make something wrong, not God's commands. And I think there Schaefer-Landau is slipping between two different ideas. And that is the idea that certain properties make something wrong, and the idea that certain properties are identical with wrongness, right? And different claims, right? So in everyday language, we recognize this. I could say my house, what made my house was this building firm. But it would be kind of silly to say my house is identical to that building firm, right? Or we might say that there might be a guy, John, who really dislikes women. Let's say he's a misogynist. And so because he dislikes women, he never gets married, right? So what makes him not get married is his hatred of women. That doesn't mean the property of hating women is identical with the property of being a bachelor, right? So I think this is where Russ Schaefer-Landau slips, because if God has reasons for his command, right, for his commands, right, that means that there are certain things that make him issue the commands, right?
Right.
Fine. But that doesn't mean that those properties are identical with wrongness, right? So if we recognize that certain things make something wrong, it doesn't follow that those things are identical with something being wrong. So I can grant his point. I can say, yeah, I agree. If God has reasons for issuing the commands he does, then those reasons make the action wrong. But that doesn't lead to saying those reasons are identical with the wrongness. All right? And as long as I don't say that last part, I haven't refuted the divine command theory, right? Because the divine command theory isn't the claim that God's commands make actions wrong. Divine command theory is the claim that moral requirements are identical with God's commands. So the making relationship and the identity relationship are different. And so what Schaeffer-Landau points out is that if God has reasons for issuing the commands he does, then there are certain features of the world, if you like, that motivate him and give him reasons for issuing the commands he does. So there's a sense in which those things, you can say those things make it wrong. It's wrong to kill because it has these properties. It's wrong to murder because it has these properties. Fine, but a divine command theorist isn't committed to denying that, right? What he's committed to denying is that anything other than God's commands are identical, right?
Right.
So is that, I know that's a little bit technical, the distinction between making and identity, I know that can get a little bit technical.
Well, that's in your discussion with Jason, how do you say his last name?
Thibodeau, yeah.
Thibodeau,
yeah.
He, you repeatedly throughout that discussion made clear when we use the word make, it's very important that we use it consistently and we don't equivocate, as we move around. And so
sometimes we can use the word make in different senses. So an example I give in my book is, suppose my son is thirsty and he wants a drink of water, right? So I can say both these things are true. I can say my son drank a glass of water because he was thirsty, and drinking water quenches his thirst. Right? I can also say my son drank a glass of water because he drank a glass of H2O. Right? Both those can be true at the same time, right? Why? Well, because I'm using the word because in different senses. In the first sense, I'm talking about some property distinct from the drinking, which explains or gives him reasons to have a drink. Right? Second sense, when I say the reason he drank the water, I'm referring to what the water is. I'm referring to some property identical with the water and pointing out that him doing one action is identical to the other, right? Now, when you say God commands it for these reasons, therefore these are the reasons that make it wrong, you are clearly using it in the first sense of the word, right? You're using it in the sense that when you say, I have a glass of water because I'm thirsty. Right? No one would think that means being thirsty is identical with H2O. You wouldn't draw that inference, right? So nor can you draw that inference by saying, well, look, God has reasons for issuing the commands he does. I think God's commands are identical with moral requirements. Therefore, those reasons must be identical to moral requirements. That doesn't follow. As a side note, Schaeffer-Landau himself admits this, because Schaeffer-Landau's own ethical theory is non-naturalism. Right? Schaeffer-Landau with a theory called non-naturalism. And so Schaeffer-Landau believes that there are non-natural properties. So he thinks moral properties are non-natural properties, not reducible to scientific empirical properties.
Which we would agree with.
He thinks that...
Right.
Which we agree with, right. But he thinks that those empirical properties make things wrong, right? So he agrees that murder might be wrong, or that rape might be wrong because of its effects on the woman, but he thinks that those properties, he thinks that these non-natural properties supervene upon these natural properties. So he's committed to the existence of making properties that are not the same as identities. So he himself makes the same move, right? He acknowledges, yes, things are wrong because they have these properties, but properties. That's part of his own non-naturalist position, any standard non-naturalist position. So his own theory requires him to make this distinction. Right? And that's another feature about a lot of attacks on divine command ethics. Often people rely on moves which, if they were which firstly aren't sound moves, but if they were sound moves, they would apply to their own theories, and all theory we know about. Yeah.
All right, so
I hope that's clear. That's a little bit technical.
Yeah, and you give the example in the book.
Things, yeah.
You give the example in the book of a judge who issues a verdict for some reasons, but those reasons are not the same as the verdict. This person's guilty. Those are separate. Those are separate things.
Right. Or yeah. Or another one I give is I could say that putting the cap on someone's head is the conferring of a degree. I don't know if you do this in America, but when we get the cap put on our head, we get up in the front of the stage and they put this cap on your head, right? So the putting the cap on someone's head is identical, you might say, is identical with the conferring of the degree, right? And there might be reasons we put that cap on people's heads. They might have handed their thesis and then passed or something, right? But those reasons aren't identical with the conferring of. Recognize that A is identical to B, and I do B reasons. It doesn't follow, therefore, that those reasons are identical to A, right? So that just seems to me a slip And the reasoning that Schaefer-Lindau uses on that.
All right. Let's see if I can get him back. I think this is what happens when you try to Skype on the other side of the world. So let's see. Can we get him back?
Okay, we're sorted.
I think this is part of the problem when we try to Skype around the world here.
It's not uncommon in my experience of Skyping people in the US, but anyway.
Yeah.
One time I was on the Unbelievable show, and they spent about 3 hours for me to get one statement out or something.
Wow. Well, I hope that everything I said wasn't lost, because we made it about an hour in. When I called you back, it said, "Do you want to resume?" So, hopefully it didn't lose everything. I really hope not.
Okay.
So we can move on from the no reasons Russ Schaefer-Landau objection. So the next one was so this is objection number 4 now, raised by Mackey and someone long before him. What was his name?
Cathwood, I think it was. Was it?
Yeah.
Cathwood? I always get the name wrong.
Yeah. And that is that in order for divine command theory to get off the ground, so to speak, there first has to be an obligation or a prior reason or a prior obligation that any command issued by God must be followed. And so I guess the idea is not all commands can be accounted for on divine command theory. There's this one that precedes it.
Right. Yep. Okay. So again, respond to this as a little bit subtle and a little bit technical. So let me make a couple of responses to that. The first response, you might call this the sort of maybe evasive response, but I still think it has a lot of merit, is that if that objection applies to divine command theory, it applies to almost every other theory that you hold, right? So if I believe, let's say my meta-ethical theory is utilitarian, and I believe that moral wrongness is identical with, I don't know, the property of causing suffering or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. It's a very, simplistic way, but say, right? Couldn't I then say, but hang on, that can't be the case unless there is a prior obligation to not cause suffering, and so you can't account for that obligation that way. Or let's say that I am a social contract theorist, right? And I think that morality is a kind of social contract, that rational people think up certain rules that will govern their behavior in accord with the facts, right? But couldn't I say, hang on, in order for that to get off the ground, you need a prior obligation to do what the social contract says, right? Or from a non-naturalist who says, no, moral properties are these non-natural properties that supervene upon natural properties, right? Mm-hmm. I say, hang on, but for that to get off the ground, there has to be this prior obligation to do actions that have those non-natural properties, right? Mm-hmm. So the first thing about that objection to see is that if that move works for divine command theory, it seems that move works with every theory, right? It seems to be, if you want to say there's this kind of statement which says you're required to do actions like this, there must be a prior obligation, seems that move generalizes. So that's the first move. It doesn't really address the problem, but it does show that if this is a problem, it is a pervasive puzzle for every ethical theory. Mm-hmm. Now, why is that important? Well, generally, unless you are a kind of nihilist who believes that all moral theory, that there is no correct moral theory because there is no such thing as morality, right? Mm-hmm. Generally, these debates are debates between protagonists of different theories, right? And these are debates about which theory is the most plausible or the best theory. In a debate about which is the best theory or the most plausible theory, if you raise an objection that applies to all theories, you don't make any move in the debate at all, right? You can't go from the theory you're critiquing to the theory you're proposing, because the reasons you've given for rejecting the theory you're critiquing also apply to your own theory, so you should give that up as well, right? So there's that aspect to it. But the second, I guess the more direct response is, I think, again, there is a subtle shift that takes place in this argument, and that is this idea of a prior obligation, right? So the argument says, look, in order for a divine command theory to get off the ground, it must be the case that you ought to do what God commands, and that is prior to the theory. That's ambiguous, right? There's two ways you could cash that idea of you ought to do what God commands out. So one way you could cash it out is you could say, there exists an obligation to do what God commands. There exists a standing obligation to do what God commands, and that's what leads to this truth of divine command theory. But when I say you ought to do something, there's a second way. There's a second thing I could be saying that's a bit different, and that's where I say, well, look, if God commands something, then you ought to do it. Right? So sometimes when I say murder is wrong, I can mean there is a standing obligation to not murder, but I also could mean if you murder, you ought not to do it. Right? Those are both ways that you can. Those are both different ways you can make that phrase. You ought not to do something. Now it's important to see that those two claims are actually different, right? When I claim there is a standing obligation not to do something, I'm committed to the existence of an obligation, saying there exists an obligation, and this obligation prohibits this kind of action, right? But when I say if God commands something, then we are obligated not to do it, I'm not committed to the existence of an obligation, right? That's a conditional statement. It's a statement that if one thing is true, then another must be true. And I can make conditional statements without being logically committed to claiming that what we call the conditional of that statement is true, right? So if I said, if I had been shot dead in the morning, I would not be having this interview, right? I'm not committed to claiming that I'm not having this interview.
Right.
I'm committed to claiming that if I'd been shot dead, I wouldn't be having this interview, right? So now let's go back to this prior obligations objection, right? The objection says that in order for a divine command theory to be true, there must be a prior obligation. That's false, right? In order for a divine command theory to be true, what must be the case is prior to a divine command, it must be true that if God commanded something, we would be obligated to do it. Doesn't require that there be a standing obligation to do what God says,
follow
right?
God's commands, yeah.
Right. So I think saying that there must be a prior obligation in order to make it true is false. All you need is that conditional statement, right? And I think that's a solution to the problem in all those theories, right? Because all these theories, they're not trying to elaborate. I mean, in my dialogue with Thibodeau, he made the distinction between what he calls a normative theory and a meta-ethical theory. And when we have a normative theory, we're kind of trying to work out what our most fundamental moral duty is. So I might say it's wrong to kill. Why? Oh, because it harms people. And then you might say, well, why is it wrong to harm? Oh, because it causes suffering. And I might say, well, why is it wrong to cause suffering? And we want to, often moral theories want to bottom out on one basic moral principle, right? One standing obligation.
Yeah.
That's a normative theory. But a meta-ethical theory isn't asking about what your most basic standing obligation is. A meta-ethical theory is asking what is wrongness itself. So when I talk about your obligations, I'm talking about what things are wrong. When I talk in meta-ethics, I'm talking about what is wrongness. And so when we give a theory of wrongness, we're trying to put out the conditions that must hold in the world for wrongness to exist. In other words, we're looking for this conditional statement. We're saying, what kinds of conditions are such that when they are in place, a moral obligation is in place, right? And then you get obligations out of that kind of position. So when we're meta-ethical theorizing, we don't rely on a prior objection. We accept that all these objections exist, and now we're trying to work out what this obligations exist. We recognize all these obligations exist, and we're now trying to ask the question, what is this feature of obligatoriness, and what conditions in the world that make up or compose or consist or constitute obligatoriness. And what needs to be the case is that if these conditions in the world come together in this way, or are like this, or are in this particular way, then a moral obligation is in existence. That's what you need. You don't need a prior obligation. And if you need a prior obligation, then every meta-ethical theory, I think, is going to collapse.
So at that point, you're pretty much saddled with nihilism. You gotta say,
either saddled with nihilism, or you're going to say, this is a puzzle or a problem that we haven't figured out yet, but I'm sufficiently confident that morality exists that I'm going to keep working on my theory, you know?
Yeah.
And sometimes we do that, you know, we don't always have all the answers with our theories. You know, if you talk to a scientist, he'll tell you there's various puzzles that scientists are working on where their theories don't seem to quite track the observations, where there's anomalies in their theories, but because their theories are so successful to date, they think it's a puzzle that they will solve. So that would be the other response. So either all theories collapse, or it's a puzzle that all theories must solve.
Yeah.
And I think if it's answerable in the way I just told you, right? By denying that you need a prior obligation and instead saying that you need this conditional claim that when certain features hold, moral obligations hold.
Perfect. Okay, so that was objection. Yeah, that was clear. I'm tracking with you. So that was objection number 4.
Yep.
So now we want to hit objection number 5. This one was raised by Michael Tooley in his debate with William Lane Craig, and it gets raised pretty much anytime divine command theory is discussed, and that is that God could have commanded atrocious acts. So how do you answer this charge?
Well, so the argument really moves like this. So it says, usually it has a paradigmatic atrocious act. Usually it's rape in the literature or something like that. So the idea is that if a divine command theory is true, then if God commanded rape, rape would be obligatory. And then the second premise is to say, well, God could have commanded rape. And then the third premise is to say, rape could never be morally obligatory. And then you end up with a contradiction, right? You end up with the claim that rape can be morally obligatory and also cannot be morally obligatory, right? That's how the argument goes. So my way of responding to that is simply just to point out the conception of God that is being used by the divine command theorist. So when the divine command theorist says moral requirements are identical with God's commands, he's not saying they're identical with the commands of just any random person, right? He's saying they're identical with the commands of God. And he understands God has a particular conception of God where God has certain attributes or character traits. So God is omniscient, God is essentially loving and just, those sorts of properties.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I respond to this was suggest, well, look, you've got to ask this question. Is it possible for a person with those character traits to command an atrocious action like, say, rape? So is it possible for a person who is fully informed, who is rational, who is loving and just, to command something like rape? Now, it seems you're going to either answer this yes or no, right? If you answer no, no being that has those kinds of traits could ever possibly command rape, then it won't be true that God can command rape, in which case the objection has a false premise, right?
Mm-hmm.
The objection, assuming that God could command this, but if God has those traits, then he can't, right? Right. So the other line of response you might make, you might say, well, maybe there are circumstances in which a loving and just, fully informed, rational being could command these things. Maybe there are really strange circumstances where a being that has those attributes could command rape. Okay. But if you buy that, right, if you think that there are circumstances in which a loving and just, fully informed being can command rape, then you must be committed to the idea that there are cases where rape is loving and just, and such that all the facts are there, that all the facts can be such that a loving and just person can rationally endorse it, right? Now, if you think that, then I think your intuitions that rape are wrong in that situations are going to be undermined, right? If you really think there are situations in which rape is loving, is just, and all the facts are there are such that no rational, fully informed person could object to it, then I think you can't say in those circumstances rape is wrong. So in other words, I think this objection has a false premise whichever way you push it, right? Mm-hmm. As soon as you accept that God has these attributes, then you're either going to have to say there are certain things he can't command, or you're going to have to say he can command them, but if he can command them, then it follows that there are certain situations in which those actions aren't wrong, right? What you can't say, I think, is saying, look, there is a being who is loving and just. Oh, and by the way, here are these properties that are always loving, unloving, and unjust, and he commands it, right? It's incoherent, right? And there is a kind of incoherence here too, in the sense that when people like Tooley or Walterson and Armstrong or the various others who raise this, they raise an example of, the reason they raise the example of, say, rape, is they take it that their audience is going to have a certain reaction, right? They take it that their audience is going to have a reaction like this. Wow, no virtuous person who is fully informed could ever endorse that. So if God endorses that, it must be really, really bad, right? That's the reason they raise that.
It's a paradigm example. Yeah. They treat it as something that under no circumstance would ever be violated, at least by a rational, fully informed person.
If that's their assumption, then I suggest that their argument's incoherent, right? I suggest if that's their assumption, they can't then turn around and say, oh, and by the way, I think God could command this, right? I think an omniscient, essentially loving and just being could command this, but by the way, no person who was ever rational and informed could endorse this kind of claim, right? So I think that once you understand the conception of God that the divine command theorist is using, this objection doesn't work. The person is committed to really an inconsistent set of intuitions.
Mm-hmm.
He's committed to the intuition that a being with these attributes could command an atrocious action, and he's also committed to the intuition that this action is a paradigm case of one that no being who is rational and virtuous and what have you could ever endorse.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just think it's incoherent. I think once you press when you press the intuitions behind each premise, you find that they're inconsistent.
Yeah. Now this may connect with the next objection. You kind of kept them separate in the book, and so the next one wants to say that. Well, no, maybe I did. Oh, yeah, impossible counterfactuals. So really, when we say this, we're talking about a counterpossible. Maybe you can explain what we mean by counterfactual and how that's different than a counterpossible.
Right. So in counterfactual reasoning, that's where we talk about something that we think is false, but we kind of reflect on what would be the case if it was true, even though we think it's false. Mm-hmm. Right. So sometimes we do this because often we dialogue in situations where we're wanting to respond to positions we may think are false, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the ways you might do that is you might assume that it's true and then press it, right? And so counterfactual reasoning involves basically that is we have a conditional statement, an if-then statement, and we say it in a context where we actually think the if doesn't hold. So I gave one before where I said, if I had been shot dead before this interview, I would not be sitting here talking to you today, right? Mm-hmm. Now that's a counterfactual because I know, and you know, that I wasn't shot dead before this interview, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm talking, what would happen if this situation occurred, but we're saying it in a context where you and I know that assumption is contrary to fact, right? Mm-hmm. So it's factual. Right? So when someone says, if God commanded this atrocious thing, he's appealing to a counterfactual, right? He's not saying God has commanded an atrocious thing. He's accepting that God hasn't, or he's accepting that nobody thinks that God has commanded this, for example, right? For the sake of argument, might be accepting that for the sake of argument, but he's accepting that, right? He's accepting, look, I know my interlocutor, the divine command theorist. So the skeptic and the divine command theorist, both these people don't think that God has issued commands to anyone today to commit rape. But what if he did, right? So that's a counterfactual, right? Now, normally, when we deal with counterfactuals, they're at least possible. They may be contrary to fact, but we accept that that's in some sense possible, right? So you'd probably want to say that it would have been possible for me to have been shot dead this morning, right? Murders happen. People get murdered. People get shot dead. Nothing logically absurd or metaphysically impossible about the idea of me being shot dead this morning. It's just never happened, right? It's contrary to fact, but it's possible. So it's a possible counterfactual. But there is a special kind of counterfactual which we call a compossible, right? And that's where we reflect on a counterfactual which we don't just think is false, we think it's literally impossible, right? So I might be talking about something that I literally think is logically or metaphysically impossible, right? So I might say, look, water is identical to H2O, and I might think the identity relationship is one that's necessary. In other words, it's impossible for two things that are identical to each other to ever be something different from each other, right? People have that intuition. But I might then reflect on, what would happen but I might say, imagine if water wasn't H2O. Imagine if water was H3O. What would follow, right? That would be a compossible. Or I might say, imagine a bachelor was actually married, right? What would follow? That's a compossible, right? Or I might say, imagine if 2 wasn't a prime number, what would be the implications for other rules in mathematics, right? So that's a compossible, right? That's the case where we engage in counterfactual reasoning and we assume for the sake of argument an impossible situation and then look at what follows from that impossible situation. Right?
Okay, so this is the kind of objection that Walter Sennett Armstrong and Louise Anthony raise. They want to say that given the definition of God that you're describing, a perfectly loving, fully rational, completely rational, fully informed being, all these characteristics, if that kind of being commanded rape, then divine command theory says it would be right. And so we want to say, well, this isn't just a counterfactual. This is actually a counter-possible.
Yeah, and Armstrong and Louise Antony accept when they set that argument up that it's a counter-possible. I mean, Louise Antony explicitly says, for example, that she's talking about counter-possibles in her article. So yeah.
And what's interesting in the book, which this was something I just learned actually fairly recently, is any counter-possible that you set up, according to the standard modal logic, the consequent is necessarily true.
Correct. So according to the standard rules of modal logic, the consequent is of a impossible counterfactual. The consequent is always true. Now that's controversial. Some people think that that's the wrong result, because some people think that there are, when you reflect on certain kinds of counterpossibles, some seem to be true and some seem to be false. So intuitively that seems wrong, but that is what the standard, if you like, the standard axioms show.
So if I said, for example, if 2 plus 2 equals 5, then pigs could fly.
Yeah, right.
And you would say, on standard modal logic, that consequent is true. Pigs would fly if 2 plus 2 equals 5. And then I could say the same. I could say if 2 plus 2 equals 6, pigs could fly. Right. And you would say that's true too. It's just you get.
So some people. So that's the standard standard view in modal logic, and how modal logic is set up. That's how what the axioms lead to. Now, some people think that that's a mistake. Some people think that that's clearly wrong, and there are certain kinds of counterpossibles which are false, and certain kind of counterpossibles which are true. And so what Louise Antony and Walter Armstrong are trying to do is they're trying to say, okay, let's assume that the standard position is false, and let's assume there's something to the intuitive response that people have that says that it's false. Surely this is a case where we have a compossible which we know is wrong, right? This is a case where we have this counterpossible which has an implication which we know is mistaken, right? This is what they're trying to do. So they're trying to say, well, yeah, technically this should be true in standard modal logic. However, we think that when we work out modal logic properly and we work out why these axioms have these counterintuitive results, and we get the answers, we're going to realize that there are some that are false and some that are true, and this clearly is a false one. This clearly is a false one. That's kind of what they're trying to do. They're trying to push to our intuitions by saying, well, look, surely you don't think that, even in this impossible situation, this is the right result. Surely we think that this is a mistake.
So then how do you answer this kind of objection? Because I know in the book you say, well, it would be true then. So it's not clear that it would just be false.
I'm inclined to think that the counterfactual is true. I mean, if you push the line, I'm inclined to think the counterfactual is not false. I think it is true. And the way I set that up in the book, though, is in the book I'm more dialectic. What I suggest is, look, if you take this line, it seems to me that every single moral theory you can possibly think of is going to be such that if you set up a impossible counterfactual, you're going to get the same result, right? So let's say that I'm a Kantian, and I think that the property of being morally required is identical with the property of being categorically prescribed by reason, right? I can then ask the question, well, imagine an impossible situation in which reason prescribes that we should commit an atrocious act, right? Or let's say that I'm hold to a form of constructivism, which holds that moral requirements are identical with what a fully informed, impartial, compassionate person would prescribe for our actions, right? I could say, well, hang on, what about an impossible situation where a fully informed, impartial, compassionate person prescribes an atrocious action? And you might come back and say, that's impossible. Yeah, I know, but this is an impossible situation. I'm allowed to set up an impossible situation, right?
Yeah.
Or suppose I'm a metaethical naturalist, and I think that wrongness is identical with properties that cause certain forms of suffering. Well, what happens if I can set up a situation where an action that's really, really atrocious doesn't cause significant suffering, even if it's impossible? So let's say I set up a situation where you engage in sadistic torture and it doesn't cause any pain, right? Which is a possibility, right? It's torture, by definition, causes pain, right? So it seems to me you can run the same line of argument with every single moral theory if you're allowed to set up an impossible situation where that theory applies to an atrocious action which in real life it could never apply to. You're going to end up with an analogous conditional. And so it seems that this line of argument, if it was true, if it was a good line of argument, would literally rule out every single meta-ethical theory that exists and any theory that is possible, because I don't even need a theory to do that. I could say, look, say there's some property P, which I think is identical with the property of being morally required. In an impossible situation in which an atrocious action had P, the implication would be of my theory that that action is morally required, right? That's simply logic, right? So if you buy this kind of line about counter possibles, it's a line that applies to any meta-ethical theory that exists and any potential meta-ethical theory. It will always be true of any theory I put forward that if I postulate an impossible situation where an atrocious action meets the requirements of the conditions of that theory, it will imply that the theory will entail that in this impossible situation, that the atrocious action is required, right? Yeah. So this is such that any theory you propose would fall foul of this position. And we can play this game with other things. I could say, okay, what would happen if H2O, the chemical property H2O, actually had all the properties all the phenomenal properties we associate with lead, right? We might think that's completely impossible. We might think that's metaphysically impossible. But let's suppose that it wasn't. Let's suppose we are postulating a possible world in which H2O totally has a different nature to the essential nature that it has. Would water be H2O? In a possible situation, right? Does that lead us to now call into question the idea that water is H2O? I don't think so. So I think part of there's a mystery about counter-possible reasoning and how it works here that hasn't really been resolved by modal logicians. But however it's resolved, I don't think it can be resolved this way, because if it's resolved this way, we're going to end up with something that refutes every single moral theory, right? Yeah. And notice that nihilism will have the same implication, right? Nihilism will have the implication that in impossible situations, atrocious actions aren't wrong. In fact, nihilism has that implication about the real world, right? So you can't say, oh, well, this is an argument for nihilism, because the reality is nihilism has the same implication. In fact, nihilism is willing to say that in the real world, atrocious actions aren't wrong, because there's no such thing as right and wrong on nihilism. So every meta-ethical theory will have this implication about a logically impossible world, and denying the truth of every meta-ethical theory will have this implication about the actual world.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
So it seems to me that this line of argument, if you're going to be committed to this line of argument, you're really in a bit of a bind with it logically, rationally, and what have you. So I don't see it as a serious objection to divine command theory. It's a case where people are reasoning about counter-possibles, and I think our intuitions about counter-possibles lead us astray. Interestingly, Walterson and Armstrong, he pushes this line of argument, but then later in the same book, he is addressing certain counterintuitive implications of his own theory, and he sort of says, well, look, we need to be suspicious of our intuitions under really strange circumstances. Right? He says, in circumstances where, really rare, unusual cases, we should be suspicious about our intuitions, because he puts forward this theory that, that wrongness is identical with harm, right? With harm. And counterexamples come up about situations. You can imagine a situation where someone is, let's say they're put unconscious and drugged and they're raped, and then they never know about it, right? Someone could ask the question, well, was this person harmed, right? Are they harmed in this situation? There's no physical harm, because if it's done the right way, you could rape someone without physically harming them, at least in certain paradigms of physical harm. There's no psychological harm, And Walterson Armstrong, one of the responses he makes to this is to say, well, look, that's a really unusual situation. And our intuitions are designed for our everyday standard events, not for really strange situations. So we shouldn't rely on intuitions in this situation. But then in the same book, he has this argument.
Wow.
Intuitively, in impossible situations, and so, I'm inclined to say something like that. I'm inclined to say when we start pressing our intuitions about impossible situations where we're talking about, counter possibles, where we're talking about, actions which we recognize as really atrocious, and we're imagining circumstances under which rational, fully informed, loving and just, morally good beings are endorsing these actions. I think surely if we're going to be suspicious of moral intuitions under any circumstances, we'd be suspicious of them under those circumstances, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Very good. Okay. So the next objection that we want to cover, so let me just count. I'm trying to keep these in order. We had the semantic objection. We had the epistemic objection. We had the no reasons objection. We had the prior reasons objection. We had the counterfactual objection, and then we just had the counterpossible objection. Now let's do the omnipotence objection, the one that Morriston raises. While you explain this, I'm still listening, but I need to grab my charger. So you can talk and everyone can hear you. I'm just going to take like 5 seconds, grab my charger.
I'll talk to the empty wall then. Yep.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so Wes Morriston tries to push for the idea of omnipotence. So what Wes Morriston argues is, he argues that if God is omnipotent, then God can command surely anything, right? A being that is omnipotent has the ability to command anything, and so he thinks that this then leads to a kind of pushback to the response that was made before. If God is omnipotent, he can command anything, so therefore surely God can command rape. That's kind of the line of argument that Morriston pushes. Right. So what do I say? What do I say in response to that? Well, I think that objection turns on how you understand omnipotence. And one of the problems here, or the issues here, is that standardly theists understand God to both be omnipotent, but also they understand God to be essentially good. They understand to have both those properties. So any theist is going to have to say something about how a being can have both these properties. And so in the literature, there's a couple of ways you can go with it. So one way you can go is to say that the property of being omnipotent and the property of being essentially good, they are compatible properties, right? If you take that, they are compatible properties, and so a being can be essentially good, and a being can be omnipotent. And when they do this, typically they limit omnipotence in some way. They either say that omnipotence is limited to logically possible actions, and a being that is essentially good doing an atrocious or immoral act is logically impossible. Or they take a line like Eric Wielenberg takes, where Eric Wielenberg says that omnipotence is not the ability to do anything that's logically possible, but the power to do anything that is logically possible. And there are certain things which it's possible to do, but we don't have the power to do. I can't get into the details of that, but there are moves that people make to try and show that omnipotence is compatible with essential goodness. The point is, whichever move you make down this line of track, you're going to end up with the conclusion that God can be omnipotent and be essentially good, and so omnipotence is not going to entail that he can command atrocious actions. So if you take that analysis of omnipotence, Morrison's argument fails, right? The other line of argument you can take is you can say, well, no, actually there's a serious problem here. If a being is omnipotent, it can do morally problematic actions, and if a being is essentially good, then it can't do those actions. And so you can't have a being that has both those properties, okay? But then the theist is going to have to decide which property God has, right? Now, what's interesting is I think most theists would say, well, in that situation, we will deny that God is omnipotent. What we will say is God has the greatest amount of power possible for a being who is essentially good. And interestingly, that is exactly the line Wes Morriston himself takes in his writings on this topic, right? Wes Morriston says that we should deny that God is omnipotent in the strict sense. What we should say is that God is a being that has the maximum amount of power that can be possessed by a being that has these kinds of attributes. And Morriston thinks that that's not a problem, because he thinks that if your commitment to God being all-powerful is the idea that God is somehow the greatest possible being, and your commitment is that he is worthy of worship, then you don't need full omnipotence in the sense that God has the power to do evil things to get that conception of God, right? If you limit it to only those powers that could be possessed, the maximum powers that could be possessed by a being that was perfectly good, you've got that conception of God. Because if you go beyond that, all you're adding to God is the power to do evil, and it doesn't seem to
That's
add
not
to
a perfection.
It's not a perfection, right? So that's the line of argument that Wes Morrison himself actually advocates, right? So in my book, I point out, well, if that's the line of argument Morrison advocates, it produces a second response to this argument, right? Because if omnipotence and moral goodness are incompatible, and God's omnipotence means that he can command something atrocious, that's a problem for the divine command theorist only if the divine command theorist says, okay, I'll accept that God's omnipotent and not essentially good, right? And the divine command theorist doesn't have to take that response to the dilemma. He could take the response to the dilemma by saying, actually, no, I think God is perfectly good, and so therefore he's not fully omnipotent. But what's more, Morrison himself has argued that that is the correct response to take, right? So that's the correct response to take. What's the problem?
Yeah,
right?
He's answered his own objection.
Right? If the problem only exists if you think omnipotence and moral goodness is incompatible, so you accept that analysis, and there are an analysis of omnipotence that don't require you to accept that. But so first you have to accept that line of omnipotence, and then secondly you have to accept that the way to solve that dilemma is the way that Morrison says is not the way to solve that dilemma, right? So you would certainly, to make this objection have legs, Morrison would have to refute himself and show that the correct way to respond to this dilemma is to accept omnipotence and not essential goodness. So that's basically, in a nutshell, my response there.
Very
so it's
good.
looking at how different in the literature, how people respond to the dilemma, and showing that each line of response to this problem on omnipotence and essential goodness leads to a solution that divine command theorists can accept, except maybe one, and the one that the divine command theorist can't accept is the one people don't generally recommend anyway. Right? Yeah.
All right, so that was the omnipotence objection. I think we've got 2 more.
Yeah.
No. 3 more. You raised quite a few, but I liked it because you were so thorough. So then you've got Eric Wielenberg, who raises the cruel and capricious God objection. So he wants to disagree with the God's this morally perfect being, he's loving, fully. He says, no. Imagine that he's cruel and so forth.
We can deal with that one reasonably quickly, because I think that one there, I mean, there's various things you could say about that, but I think that one there is essentially another version of counterpossibles, right? So in the counterpossible one we were looking at before, the idea was you imagine that God has the attributes he does, but you imagine logically impossible situations in which a being with those attributes commands something atrocious. And this one, say, okay, now let's imagine metaphysically impossible situations in which God has a totally different nature to the one he essentially has, right? I think you're going to end up with the same general line of response, right? So you're asking us to take a theory, and then you're imagining an impossible world in which all the attributes that the thing you're identifying morality with don't really exist, right? The thing in question actually has radically different attributes to what it really does have, and you're saying, hey, look, now this theory looks really bad in this impossible situation, right? And I'm somewhat suspicious of that move, because again, I'm going to think, well, imagine if we say, so imagine we identify moral goodness with, I don't know, enhancing someone's welfare. And now imagine a possible situation in which enhancing welfare has really radically different properties to what we attribute to it. So all the properties we would normally attribute to harming someone are the properties we attribute to enhancing welfare. So I do this action which is really, really harmful, but it's actually enhancing their welfare. What are your intuitions about that? Well, I'm kind of puzzled by that situation, because it seems to me that what you've done is you've taken the very features that make welfare enhancement, right? And you've asked us to imagine an impossible situation in which those are the opposite of what they really are. Right? And when we look at the theory in that situation, it seems bizarre, but that's because we've set it up that way, right? And I think this is really just another version of the counterpossible objection. It's just a different way of doing it. Yeah. And I think the response it's the same, right? If you're allowed to take the features of something and then make them the complete logical opposite of what they are, and then ask, does it work in this new imagined impossible situation where we've flipped the properties? I think you're going to get really counterintuitive implications, but I think you're going to get that of any theory you put forward, right?
Yeah.
Imagine an impossible situation in which being rational actually had all the attributes we associate with being irrational. And suddenly we find that in an impossible situation, irrational actions are rational, right? The rationality endorses irrational actions because, it seems to me kind of,
that makes your head spin. Yeah, it's so weird.
I'm not sure that it really shows substantively what people think it shows. Maybe I'm standing Wielenberg here, but it does seem to me. I mean, Mark Murphy actually has a line of response to Wielenberg along these lines. He thinks, look, if you're allowed to, if we're going to say the divine command theory only works in all possible worlds and doesn't work in radically impossible ones, he says, I'm not sure that that's going to really count as an objection to divine command theory. And I think there's to that response, right? Yeah.
So that was the cruel and capricious God objection. Now, this is the last one about arbitrariness kind of objections. In the category of arbitrariness objections, we've gone through several. This is the last one, and that is the psychopathy objection.
Oh, yeah. Sam Harris's version.
Yeah, you can. I know Wielenberg's done something along the line. So if you want to,
the psychopathy, Wielenberg's one, that's about the promulgation objection. Wielenberg's one is
okay.
Yeah. So the psychopathy. So yeah, I think this is just one where this is one Sam Harris pushes. I'm trying to remember exactly what Harris says, but his basic idea is that a divine command theory commits you to a sort of psychotic state of mind.
Yeah, he gives the example of blowing up. If God commanded you to blow up a bus full of children, then you would be obligated to do it, but only a psychopath would.
Yeah. So you're right. So that's a good way of summarizing it. So his claim is a divine command theory has the implication, or has the entailment, that if God commanded you to blow up a bus of children, you would be required to blow up a bus of children, right? And then his second point is to say, look, only a psychopath would be willing to do that. And so therefore, the divine command theory entails that you should be willing to be a psychopath, right? So again, this to some extent, this ties in with what I've already said, right? So if you accept that God has the attributes that a divine command theorist says, then what Harris is setting up here is, remember his position is entirely hypothetical. He's saying, well, look, in this hypothetical situation in which God commanded you to blow up a bunch of children, you would be required to blow up a bunch of children. Yeah, but if we think if we understand what's being said there, if we understand the attributes that a divine command theorist thinks God has, then we're saying, okay, so if there was a situation in which a loving and just, fully informed, rational person commanded you to blow up a bus of children, then you would be required to blow up a bunch of children. Well, it seems to me true that it seems to me that it's true that a divine command theorist has the implication that if that happened, you're required to blow up a bunch of children, right? But notice it's under that hypothetical situation. It's under a hypothetical situation in which a loving and just person, aware of all the facts, who is reasoning correctly, would endorse blowing up a bus of children. Now, you might not think it's very likely that could ever happen. It doesn't matter. What Harris has said is that if this were to happen, this is the implication, right? But surely, if that's the hypothetical situation, it's not a situation which is psychopathic, right? Right? You've specified that this is a situation in which a loving and just, empathetic person, who's loving, who's fully irrational, who's fully aware of the facts. It's only in circumstances where, if they could exist at all, where a person with those attributes would endorse blowing a bus of children. So, by definition, that is not a situation where only a psychopath would endorse it, right? Psychopaths are people who lack empathy. Psychopaths who lack those attributes, right? Some people think that psychopaths lack some kind of rational insight into their own behavior. So, by definition, a psychopath is a person who does not have those attributes. The kind of hypothetical situations in which a being that has God's attributes would endorse that kind of action are the kinds of situations in which it is not psychopathic to endorse it, right? First thing to say about it. Second thing to say about it is this, again, is true of every moral theory that you put forward, right? Every moral theory that you put forward, it is such that if the conditions of that theory were such that they applied to blowing up a bus of children, you would be required to blow up a bunch of children. That's just the logic of the theory. If I say that an action is the property of wrongness is identical with this property here, then it will be true that if this property were the property of blowing up a bus of children, it would have the property of being wrong, right? That's true of the logic of every single theory you can put forward. As soon as you say that some property is equivalent to wrongness, it will be true that if, hypothetically, in some situation, even if that situation is not possible, you apply that property to blowing up a bus of children, it will be applied to blowing up a bus of children will be wrong, right? So this isn't really a I don't think this is a really terribly smart objection on Sam Harris's part. All he's doing is he's exploiting something that is the nature of the logic of those kinds of statements. He's setting up a situation where all kinds of really strange conditions are present, such as that a being that has all these attributes could endorse killing, and then he's saying, oh look, isn't this awful? And he's really playing on people's intuitions about the real world by setting up an example about hypothetical world and not getting them to really think about what they're asking. He's asking what would be true under these hypothetical situations. Sure, but under these hypothetical situations, most of the responses we have in the real world would no longer apply because the factual situation will be different, right?
Perfect. Yeah, and I think Sam Harris wants to say, if you give that kind of response, he says, well, that's essentially just saying, well, you gave a better response, but in the debate with Craig where he brought this up, he says, all Craig can do is make a faith statement and say, you got the wrong God, buddy. God didn't command you to do that. And you point out in the book that Harris is just as committed to making that kind of statement.
So let's say the jihadist comes along and says, God has commanded me to blow up a busload of children. What does Harris say? No, he hasn't. Right? Is that a faith-based statement? Right? So Harris is going to say, well, why does Harris say that? Well, I don't believe that. Harris says something along the lines of, because I know that anyone who commanded that would be an evil bastard, right? But that's the response he makes. Well, let's run with that response. So he says, no, I know that any God that commanded that would be an evil bastard, right? Well, so what you're saying is that a loving and just person would not command this, right? That's essentially when Harris makes this kind of profanity offhand, about an evil bastard or whatever, right? That's essentially what he's saying. He's saying no loving and just person would endorse this. Okay, but isn't that exactly the response the divine command theorist makes? So he's making the same response. So if it's just an arbitrary faith-based response that's irrational, then Harris can't critique jihadists, right? Harris can't turn around and say, jihadism is wrong. That's a faith statement, right? So what Harris is going to have to say is he's going to say to be committed to some kind of idea that we really can't know that a loving and just person would never command something like that, right? We really can't know that a loving and just person would never command rape under normal circumstances or killing under normal circumstances. Well, if that's true, if we really can't know that, then I think he's undercut moral knowledge in general, right? If we really can't know that, given the facts, love and justice, we can't tell if it endorses these things. Right. And I think if you're committed to that, you have no answer to that question other than an arbitrary faith claim. I think you're going to find that you're not going to be able to say anything about justice or anything about what the facts entail or anything what is the rational response in that situation. Presumably, the reason Harris thinks that the jihadist position is irrational or problematic is because he thinks there are certain facts about the world which is such that he knows from those facts that any being that commanded those things would not be a loving and just being. So when he makes the offhand comment that he can dismiss this, he's actually making the same response that Craig makes.
Very good. Okay, so that rounds out the kind of arbitrariness objections to divine command theory. Now there's two left, and these are emptiness objections. So Peter Van Inwagen says can God be good if he has no moral obligations? That's his question. And his answer is basically it's meaningless to call God good if he doesn't have moral obligations. So you can explain that more clearly. I probably didn't do a good job, and you can answer it.
Right, so the basic idea is that if you hold to a divine command theory, then you hold that moral obligations are identical with divine commands in some way, right? And so now let's say the divine command theorist wants to say God is good. The question becomes, how does he cash out or make sense of the claim that God is good? Surely he can't make sense of it by saying, well, God follows whatever obligations he has, because obligations depend on God's commands, right? So he can't be good prior to giving these obligations. He can't be good prior to giving these commands, because there are no obligations prior to him giving these commands, right? So in what sense can you say that God is good prior to commanding? That's really the kind of line of argument. So the idea is that goodness, being good, is the same thing as just fulfilling your obligations. Prior to God issuing any commands, there are no obligations. So therefore, prior to God issuing any commands, he cannot be good. Right? So what's the response to that? Well, I think the response to that is simply to say that, was to say something like this, is to say, well, that's true if you understand goodness purely in terms of fulfilling one's moral obligations, right? So if you think that all there is to being good is just fulfilling one's moral obligations, then it's true that God cannot be good, right? But there are other senses it's true that God cannot be good prior to issuing any commands, right? But there doesn't seem to be any reason why, when I say God is good, I have to understand it in that way, right? So there's another way you could claim that God was good prior to him issuing any moral obligations, and that is, you could say, well, prior to God issuing any moral obligations, you could say prior to God issuing any commands, he has no moral obligations, but he does have certain character traits, right? So you could say that prior to issuing any commands, God has the character trait of being loving, or you might say he has the character trait of being just, or you might say he has the character trait of being impartial, right? And I think you can make sense of the idea of somebody having those traits quite apart from any idea of an obligation. So I think a person can be loving towards something or someone even if they don't have an obligation to be loving towards someone or someone, right? Mm-hmm. So I could say, if let's say someone reads they read John Mackey's Defense of Moral Nihilism, and they become convinced that there are no moral obligations in the world. It doesn't follow from that they can't love their children, right? Mm-hmm. If you said to them, hey, you're loving your children, they'll go, yeah, I like my children, I love my children. I don't think I'm obligated to do it, but nevertheless I'm doing it and I enjoy it, right? Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that the concept of something being loving, and even in certain meanings of the word, the concept of something being just, and the concept of something being impartial, and the concept of something being good for a person in the sense that it enhances their welfare, makes them happy, that sort of thing. Seems we can make sense of all those things quite independently of any account of moral obligation. So we can say that God is good in the sense that he has those attributes, right? What we can't say is he's good in the sense that he has moral obligations, but we can say he's good in that other sense. And in the same article, by the way, Van Inwagen accepts this, right? He accepts, well, look, God can't be morally perfect in the sense that he obeys his moral obligations, but he accepts that God can be good in the sense that he is loving or benevolent or has certain character traits. So I don't think that's a very powerful objection. All it means is that we cannot say God is good in one sense in which that word is sometimes used, but it allows us to say God is good in multiple other senses. And I don't think we need to say God is good in that one sense for it to do any work in the theory. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Perfect. I stumbled over a bit there. Yeah.
That was good. All right, this is the last one, and that is raised by Sam Harris, and he asserts God does not have to be good.
Right. So Harris thinks that once you accept a divine command theory, then you're committed to this idea that God does not have to be good. And so that undermines the idea, the claim that God is essentially good. And I think this just rests on a confusion, and that's a confusion on the way the word have is being used. So sometimes when I say I have to do something, I mean I'm morally required to do it. So I might say, look, I really have to pay my respects to this person whose relative has just died, And when I say that, what I mean is I'm under some kind of moral obligation to do that. Perhaps because of my relationship to that person, I have a moral obligation to pay my respects. Or I might say, I really have to give to this charity. What I mean by that is there's some kind of moral compulsion, right? I'm morally required to. I might say to my son, look, you have to tell the truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I'm saying morally required to tell the truth, right? So that's one sense of the word have. Another sense of the word have, we use it when we're referring to what is logically or metaphysically possible. So I might say, well, look, a triangle has to have 3 sides, or a bachelor has to be an unmarried man, or water has to be H2O, right? There I'm using the word have in a sense of metaphysical necessity or logical necessity, right? So when the divine command theorist claims that God does not have to be God does not have to be good, he's using it in the first sense, right? He's using it in the sense of God is not under any moral obligation to do what is good, right? Because he's the source of moral obligations. Obligations come about because he issues commands. So he's not under any moral obligation to be good. I agree, but that doesn't mean that God doesn't have to be good in the second sense, where we're talking about what is logically, conceptually, metaphysically possible. In fact, divine command theorists hold that God is an essentially good person, and so therefore it isn't metaphysically possible or conceptually possible to say that God does evil. But that's a different sense of the word have. So when the divine command theorist says God does not have to be good, he's only committed to that in the moral sense, but that doesn't tell us that he can't be committed to it in the conceptual and metaphysical sense. And it's the second sense he needs to make sense of the idea that God is essentially good. So I think that's just a confusion. I think a lot of these things Harris does plays on ambiguity in language. Both the objections we've discussed involves trading on ambiguity. Take a situation which we know would be psychopathic. Now imagine a situation in which it's not psychopathic. Oh my God, we committed to something psychopathic, And in this situation, you've got the same thing, Take this idea of the word have. Now use it in a sense very different to the sense it's used. Wow, we're committed to the idea that God doesn't have to be good, I think some of the new atheists like Harris and Dawkins play a lot on these rhetorical slippages in words and aren't really doing precise, serious moral philosophy. People like Wes Morrison, Michael Tooley, on the other hand, they're much more precise, they're much more careful, and I have a lot more time for their objections.
Yeah. Okay. Well, just as a recap, and I will say to the viewers, I'm sorry if the first half of the discussion got lost, but I feel like that's just the risk you run when you try to Skype from the U.S. to New Zealand. But we did, it looks like, catch about an hour here, at least. So I feel like that's good at the very least. But we ran through all the following objections. We ran through the semantic objection, the epistemic objection, the no reasons objection, the prior reasons objection, the counterfactual objection, the counterpossible objection, the omnipotence objection, the psychopathy objection, the God doesn't have moral obligation, so he can't be good objection, and God doesn't have to be good objection. So we hit it all. Well, a lot of it. We hit a lot of it.
That's actually not at all, believe it or not, but yeah, a lot of it. Yeah.
So maybe we can have you back on sometime if you're willing, and we can discuss the other sections of the book. Those were fantastic as well. But I really like this one in particular because, you don't have to take too long to correct me if you think I'm wrong about this, but the rest of the book kind of shows that we're not talking about, we might not be talking about God commanding, so there's a focus on God driving people, telling the Israelites to drive out the Canaanites. That's the primary command. It's not go and slaughter them. But even if he does command, what looks like totally wipe them out, anything that breathes, really that's like rhetoric, war rhetoric of the time. That's how you just spoke about those things, and those people are still around. And I think all that's a great point. But I like this section of the book because even if only one innocent person is taken out, then you still got something to wrestle with. Yeah,
I agree, and that's why I made a point of writing the second half of the book. A lot of people, I wrote some stuff earlier on the sort of war rhetoric side of it, and a lot of people sort of seem to think that that was some kind of silver bullet, that it got rid of all the moral problems. And I increasingly became kind of concerned that it probably wasn't. Like it addressed part of the problem, but it didn't really address all of the problem. And I wanted to hit both prongs. I think there's two issues. Well, I think with anything like this, there's two issues that often come up. So there's an exegetical question: is are we reading the text correctly? And then there's a moral question: is are moral judgments about the text, right? And this is what's going to happen. You're going to read a text, you're going to judge that the text is saying something atrocious. There's two ways you can go. You can say, well, the text doesn't really say that, or you can say my judgments, my moral judgments are incorrect. But often I think it's actually a bit of both. I think sometimes what's happened is the text says something that might be morally challenging, and then skeptics exaggerate it, or they distort it, or in the retelling it gets sort of puffed up to much more than it is. So the moral problem becomes a much bigger moral problem, and so then it's a much bigger clash with our moral intuitions, right, or our moral judgments. And I'm a fallibilist about our moral judgments. I don't think our moral judgments are infallible. I think they're generally reliable, but I think they're infallible. But I don't think they're infallible. And so I do want to say that we should be a little bit careful about the idea that if a text purports to be a divine revelation, well, obviously it's got to agree with all my moral intuitions, because God would never disagree with me, right? My moral intuitions are just going to track what God says perfectly. I think that's unlikely, So I wanted to say a little bit about some of those other things in the text. So I wanted to make sure that there was a discussion of the moral problems and a discussion of the exegetical problems, and both were dealt with. And I'm glad you noticed that, because I came across a lot of reviewers seem to have never read the second half of the book, right? Or the second part that you read. They read the first part and then they just would say, oh, this doesn't solve all the problems. I'm sort of sitting there scratching my head going, why did you say that, given I devoted so many chapters to addressing that?
Right. Yeah. And I don't want to, I appreciate the first half of the book. I think that that's great too, and needed. Like that needs to be part, the exegetical task is a part of the answer, and it should be done. I think this part's the book is, for me, where the rubber really meets the road, because if God commands even one innocent person be taken out, our moral intuitions leap in, but how could he do that? And so that's where this, I think, is so useful. So maybe we can have you back on if you're willing, and we can discuss the first half, but I'm glad we got to talk about this. There's one question that people had, and this will be the last thing that we say, and we'll sign off. Multiple people, I don't know if this guy's the same one as the one on Facebook, but there was somebody on Facebook and someone here in the comments. They want to know if Jeremy Kuhn's objection takes out divine command theory. So I sent you that paper. What do you think?
So I know the paper. I've read it ages ago. So there's a response and a short response. I'll give the short response. And the short response is no, because if you read Jeremy Kuhn's paper, it's not actually a critique of divine command theory. It's a critique of William Lane Craig's account of God's goodness. So William Lane Craig is a divine command theorist, and he appends to his divine command theory a particular account of the nature of goodness, where he identifies goodness with God's nature. Now, some divine command theorists do that. They give a divine command account of moral obligation, and they give a divine nature account of moral goodness. And some do not, right? There are some who have totally different accounts of goodness. So it's Stephen Evans, John Hare, various others. And so what Kuhn's raises in that article is he critiques Craig's understanding of what goodness is and how that relates to the divine nature, and raises questions about that. So even if you accepted everything that Kuhn says, it doesn't actually refute the divine command theory aspect of Craig's position. It critiques the coherence of a divine command theory with the other half of what Craig wants to say about goodness and so on, right? So now I actually don't myself accept that other half of Craig's theories, right? Craig's understanding of moral goodness, I have a different take on that. So it doesn't affect, for example, my version at all. It doesn't affect John Hare's version. It doesn't affect Stephen Evans' version. And it doesn't actually affect a divine command theory. It affects a divine command theory when it is conjoined with the kind of account of goodness that William Lane Craig wants to say. That said, Craig himself also gave some, in one of his reasonable faith podcasts, he actually has said some criticisms of Kuhn's theory, which I thought were at the time were reasonably fair. But even if you don't buy that, I don't think that Kuhn's article addresses divine command theory. And that's one of the reasons I haven't really responded to Kuhn's, because I thought, what would I really say other than saying, okay, this critiques some things that Craig adds to his divine command theory that's not essential to divine command theory, that lots of other divine command theorists don't accept. I could say that in a few paragraphs. I wasn't sure there was really a lot to write. So that's the reason why I haven't really responded to it.
I guess
people,
I'll say this. The Darwin's Greatest Hits guy that's asking this question, that's his YouTube name. This could be part of the confusion as well. Is the divine command theorists can all agree on this point, I think, and that is that divine command theory is focused on deontology.
Correct. And
if certain divine command theorists want to try and append axiology somehow, they can try to do that, but that's not essential to divine command theory.
Right.
And so what Kuhn's is critiquing is a divine command theorist who wants to try and account for axiology as well, at least in terms of locating it in God's nature.
Right.
But not all divine command theorists will do that. You mentioned Hare and Evans are content to leave divine command theory focused solely on deontology, and they don't append this kind of axiological thing as well. So
that's right.
I think that's getting at some of what Darwin's Greatest Hits here is saying. He's saying another way to put Kuhn's objection is it plausible to say that the virtues are good because God has it? And he says the question isn't directed towards obligations. So we can, it's right. It's not about deontology.
And nothing about a divine command theorist commits him to saying the virtues are good, and that virtues are good because they're part of God's nature, right? That's a theory of axiology that Robert Adams and William Lane Craig have defended. And most, like I said, not all divine command theorists defend that. In fact, historically, most divine command theorists didn't defend that. So there's nothing about a divine command theory that commits me to Craig's account of what makes virtues good, right? So, and in fact, I'm not convinced by Craig's account of what makes virtues good. So there is a sense in which that's just an irrelevant point. And what sometimes happens here is, particularly when you're dealing with on the YouTube or enthusiasts for this, people will sort of see an article that champions their hero, and so they say, "Oh, this article's great." Well, they'll see, I'm not saying that this is what your correspondent is doing, but sometimes people do this, or they'll see an article that critiques Bill Craig, and they go, "Oh, wow, this is the takedown," or whatever, rather than sort of carefully looking, and particularly when the article has a one-line heading like, does goodness save a divine command theory? What Kuhn's is really asking is, does Craig's particular understanding of goodness cohere with or work as a response to a particular objection to divine command theory? And when you read the paper, it's very clear that's what's going on. He's attacking Craig's axiology. He says very little about Craig's divine command theory. And Craig's and he says very little about divine command theory per se. So I don't think it does refute a divine command theory. It raises questions about a particular way of cashing out axiology that some divine command theorists, some prominent divine command theorists, have put forward.
Perfect. I would be really interested in having either your take, or maybe you could point me to some other Christian scholar who I could interview if you didn't want to do it, where we could talk about the relationship between God and axiology. Because I feel like reading your work really helped me understand at least the divine command theorist take on God and deontology. But do you have anyone you could recommend? Something that isn't Craig's, because I get Craig's view, and I'm not dismissing his view, but I would like maybe a different perspective. It sounds like you have one.
Yeah, well, I haven't thought it through in a great deal. One person who's written a lot on axiology, actually, from a divine command theorist sort of perspective, sort of loosely a divine command theorist, he writes on axiology, is actually Thomas Carson.
Thomas Carson?
I'm not entirely sold on his theory, but he writes an entire book largely on axiology, where he argues that you should see axiology in terms of divine desires or something like that. It's very, very different to Craig's, right? But yeah, so how you cash out axiology is there's multiple different ways you can cash out axiology. The relationship between God and axiology. And Craig's taking a kind of Platonic line, a Platonist line, where you have the idea where goodness is really a kind of exemplar, if you like. There's a kind of paradigmatic good thing, and goodness is kind of seen in terms of its similarity to the good thing. That's a very view that's goes back to Plato. But there are Aristotelian views of the good where goodness is actually more about human flourishing, right? There are hedonist accounts of good where good is about what causes people pleasure and pain, right? And you could say God created the nervous system that people feel pleasure and pain from, So there's all kinds of different ways. I mean, John Mackey, interestingly enough, actually develops a divine command theory in his book on nihilism. He sort of says, here's a kind of chapter where he says, by the way, a divine command theory gets you out of all the problems I'm spelling out, but because I'm an atheist, you can reject it. And he actually responds to the Euthyphro, where he develops a almost hedonistic account of axiology. So the point is, there's lots of moves that are made in the literature here that you can make other than the one Craig makes around axiology.
Okay. I will have to... I've not read God and Moral Obligations by Stephen Evans, but does he discuss axiology at all in there, like what the good is? Or?
So he discusses both virtue. He discusses the relationship between divine command theory and virtue theory, and a divine command theory and natural law theory. And he makes the case that a natural law theory is more plausibly understood as a theory of the good, and virtue theory is a theory of what is a good character, and a divine command theory is a theory of obligation.
So he kind of takes a little bit of everything then.
Yeah. So a natural law theory is very based on the idea that there's certain things that are naturally good for us, right? My nature is such that drinking petrol is not good for me, but drinking water is, right? To put it really, really crudely. And so a natural law theory is based on the idea that there are certain things that are good for us in virtue of our nature, and morality is about pursuing our nature, right? And some people think that these are incompatible with the divine command theory, and what Evans argues, he says, no, I can grant that. I can grant that, what's good for us is what in some way perfects our nature, what's good for us is what's naturally good for us. But that doesn't explain obligation. That doesn't explain why we're obligated to do what is, why are we obligated to do what's good for us and other people in certain circumstances. It might be that certain actions are good for other people and good for us in that sense, and they harm us or hinder our natural, that they're naturally good for us, naturally bad for us. But that doesn't answer the question of what, when we say that it's wrong to inflict certain kinds of natural evils on people, it doesn't answer the question of what wrongness is. And he also says that a divine command theory is going to want to have something to say about what is a good character trait, and he suggests that the question of what is a good character trait is a different question to what is a moral obligation, right? So I could ask again, I might say that giving a kidney to an needy stranger displays really good character traits, right? It displays a lot of altruism, it displays a lot of care and concern for other people, but that doesn't really address the question of are we obligated to have that character trait, and it doesn't address the question of what is an obligation. So Stephen Evans has a couple of chapters where he sort of talks about this and suggests that whatever virtue theory people develop, it's compatible with divine command theory, and whatever account of natural goods a natural law theorist develops, it's compatible with the divine command theory, because the divine command theory is a theory of obligation.
That's interesting. Does Hare make a similar move? I haven't. When it comes to axiology, does he?
So Hare has a view of the good where goodness is kind of like, he has an account of goodness which is a bit more like, he sees goodness more in terms of in terms of flourishing. So sometimes we use the word good. So Craig's talking about goodness in the sense of virtue. What is a good character trait? So Craig has to make that sort of basic. So for Craig, the basic question is, what is a good person? What is a good character trait? Oh, a good character trait is a character trait that God has, right? Hare has a different approach altogether. So John Hare's approach is to say, well, look, there are certain things that are a good flourishing life. So for him, goodness is the kind of life that enables us to flourish, enables us to be happy, enables us to meet our potential, and so on. So it's a much more, it's good in the sense of what is good for us. And so he has this idea that certain things are good for us. They're such that we They're things that we desire and seek and fulfill our desires and make us happy and so on. And then God commands a set of actions which, if we follow those actions, will enable us to flourish. And so he's not talking about good character traits in the sense of virtues. He's talking about good character traits in terms of what is good for us. And so he has an account of what is good for us. And then the obligatory comes in because we think there's a link between what is obligatory and what is good for us. And we think we're obligated to not inflict certain harms upon people. And we think we're obligated to do certain good things to people. In other words, we're obligated to benefit people in certain kinds of ways, and we're prohibited from harming people in certain kinds of ways. And so we want to, when we're asking about obligations, we're asking, okay, when we are required to refrain from certain kinds of harms or required to promote certain kinds of goods, what is this property of obligatoriness that we're talking about? Mm-hmm. And so for here, God has certain goals for human beings. God wants human beings to flourish in certain kinds of ways. And so he issues commands to human beings because if human beings behave in accord with these commands, that will enhance human flourishing. So there you're not identifying goodness with good character traits. You're saying goodness is about, you're talking about goodness in the sense of what is good for people, what makes them flourish, and then obligations are those actions which God commands, and God is motivated by that concern for human flourishing, right?
So would Evans or Hare say God is the good, or they wouldn't go that? They wouldn't say that.
They wouldn't take that line, no. So their view of good is more, you might call more Aristotelian.
Mm-hmm.
So Plato had this idea that there was this thing called the form of the good. So transcending the natural world was this perfect thing called goodness, and it's out there as a form, and things in the world are good or bad in terms of how much they resemble this form of goodness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now you transform that theistically, God becomes the form of the good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle had a much more down-to-earth view than that. Aristotle had, no, what's good is what we all naturally seek. We all naturally, as human beings, seek certain things which enable us to flourish and be happy and live a good life. And that's what goodness is all about. Goodness is about a happy, flourishing life. It's about what is good for us. In Aristotle, what is good for us is primary, and any character traits that are good because they enable us to live that kind of life. And morality is all about what kinds of actions will enable us to live that kind of life and enable our neighbours to live that kind of life. So for Aristotle, it's all about what is good for us, and that is determined to some extent by our nature. We are such that certain things are naturally good for us and certain things are harmful for us, right? And divine command theorists can fall down either way on that debate between Plato and Aristotle, right? A divine command theorist can say there are certain things that are naturally good for us, and God's commands are motivated by his concern for human welfare. Or a natural law theorist can say there is such thing as the form of the good, and God is identical with that form, and his commands reflect that nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Craig and Adams are, if you like, Platonists.
Mm-hmm.
And
even though remarkably, Craig is all about not Platonism, but it's very...
and Stephen Evans, and John Hare to some extent are Aristotelians. Right?
Okay, that's really interesting, because that was in my next kind of thing I'm going to start studying is the relationship between God and axiology. So you've been helpful, very helpful. Thank you.
All right, no problem.
All right, I will wrap it up there. People can follow you at your website. It's M&M. What?
Yeah, .org.z.
Yeah, .org. The link I will make sure I put in the description. It's great. You'll learn lots from him, like I have. So, thank you for taking so much time for me.
No problem.
All right, we'll see you, everyone.
Later.